Chapter 91. New Blood. In the final days of Aegon's stay on the Iron Islands, many Ironborn came to Orkmont of their own accord to see him off. They brought pickled fish, a local specialty, as gifts for the king. In the depths of winter, it was likely the most precious thing they owned. For saving hundreds of thousands of Ironborn refugees, Aegon had earned the loyalty of many among the Ironborn. In the palace at Orkmont, Aegon received a letter from Maria Martell, the Yellow Toad, of Dorne. I will neither fight you nor kneel to you. Remember House Martell's words, unbowed, unbent, unbroken. Burn it all down if you must, Dragonlord Aegon. We will never yield, never bend, and never surrender. Dorne does not welcome a Dragonlord of Valyria. If you dare to invade, you will pay the price. Furious, Aegon tore Maria's letter to shreds and threw it into the fire. In a rage, he stormed through the palace, swearing to bring ruin and extinction upon Dorne. Alongside the Dornish letter came another, this one penned by Archmaester Ollider, detailing the history of Dorne. Aegon had ordered the historians at Harrenhal to compile intelligence on Dorne, and Ollider had delivered. In his letter, Ollider wrote, he recounted how, 1,000 years ago, Princess Nymeria, a Rhoynar warrior from the eastern continent, led her people to escape the Valyrian Freehold's invasion by sea. After years of wandering, they landed in the territory of House Martell. The head of House Martell took Nymeria as his wife, and from their union arose the unbending culture of House Martell. Reading this, Aegon scoffed. So, they were old enemies after all. Back in the days of the Freehold, the Dragonlords had sent over 300 dragons to invade the ancestral lands of the Rhoynar. The Rhoynar were nearly wiped out by the Valyrians, and Nymeria's warriors were among the few who escaped. Seeing that this woman refused both diplomacy and threats, Aegon ordered the small council in Harrenhal to begin preparations for war against Dorne. At the same time, he commanded the Stepstones, now under Targaryen control, to blockade Dorne and bar Dornish ships from passing through the narrow sea. He also wrote to his father in the Federal Council, urging them to ban trade with Dorne and confiscate all Dornish property within council-held territory. With those decisions made, Aegon remained on Orkmont for 2 more days. On the final day, he summoned all the lords of the Iron Islands. The lords from the Reach, Riverlands, Westerlands, and the Iron Islands gathered in the square outside the palace on Orkmont to bid farewell to the king. Escorted by numerous officials and the 3 high lords, Aegon emerged slowly from the palace. He wore gold-plated steel armor and a dragonwinged helmet, his presence commanding and regal. For many Ironborn, this was their first time laying eyes on the new king, and his AWE-inspiring appearance drew waves of cheering from the crowd. Corlys and his guards struggled to maintain order as the Ironborn, overcome with zeal, surged toward the platform with the fervor of adoring fanatics. Aegon stepped onto the high stage built before the palace for this very moment. With all eyes on him, he raised his voice and spoke. My people, I'm truly pleased to see you all here to send me off. You are now part of the Targaryen dynasty, welcome to the family. I've heard that the Ironborn have an ancient tradition, taking iron from their enemies through acts of plunder. But in my kingdom, such violence against your own kin will not be tolerated. That's why I've instructed House Greyjoy to alter their house words, as a warning. Never raise your hand against your brothers and sisters. Still, during these past months spent among you, I've come to admire your strength. I respect the ambition that drives you, the fire in your blood, and your eagerness for battle. Because of that, I grant the Ironborn a special privilege. In my kingdom, the Ironborn shall have the right to plunder, legally. I will issue plunder licenses to the 7 strongest captains of the Iron Islands, giving you the right to strike the enemies of House Targaryen and unleash your true nature upon them. These 7 pirate captains shall be known as the 7 warlords of the king. They are, the head of House Greyjoy, the head of House Drum, the head of House Blacktide, the head of House Botley. The Ironborn and the lords of the Green Lands stared at Aegon in astonishment, shocked that he would announce such a bold decree just before his departure. The lords of Westeros, though, breathed a silent sigh of relief. Thankfully, the 7 warlords would only be allowed to target the enemies of the Targaryen dynasty. Otherwise, the coastal regions of Westeros would never know peace. Some of the more informed lords had already guessed the source of Aegon's fury, Dorne. Sure enough, Aegon named them directly in the next part of his speech. Thunderous cheers erupted from the square. Long live King Aegon. The 7 warlords will strike fear into our enemies. We will follow the king to war, wherever he leads. The Ironborn lords took a liking to Aegon. In their eyes, his policies preserved the essence of the ancient ways of the Iron Islands, which was unique to the Ironborn. Every Ironborn aspired to become one of the 7 warlords of the king, to bring glory to their house and their islands. Aegon pressed down with his left hand, waited for the cheers to subside, then continued. Now there is an evil enemy in Westeros that has defied the orders of the Targaryen dynasty, the kingdom of Dorne. My 7 warlords. Go collect the iron money you deserve from the Dornishmen, unleash the tyranny in your blood on the coast of Dorne, and strike fear into the hearts of the enemies of the Targaryen dynasty. When Aegon finished his speech, Valyrian flew down from above the palace. Amidst the deafening cheers of the crowd, he climbed onto the back of the dragon and looked down at the people below, who all bowed their heads and knelt before him, making Aegon feel a little giddy. Valyrian flapped his wings and flew high into the sky. The cold wind whistled into the dragon's saddle, and Aegon closed the skylight. On the return trip, he and the Black Dread would pass Harlaw and then fly along the Blue Fork of the Trident to Harrenhal. When they arrived at Harrenhal in the afternoon, they learned that the royal ministers and the people had been waiting outside the castle. Aegon stood on the dragon's back and looked around. After nearly 4 months away, the market around Harrenhal had become even more prosperous and lively. The 2 queens complained about Aegon's long absence. Visenya wanted to ride a dragon to Orkmont to look for him, but Aegon dissuaded her. After all, the affairs of Harrenhal needed to be handled by the royal family. Rhaenys was 7 months pregnant, and her belly was growing larger. Aegon comforted his wife. The king returned, and Harrenhal held a banquet. Aegon noticed dozens of unfamiliar noble faces in the castle. They were all vassals of the kingdom who had heard of the king's return and had come to see him. During the banquet, Visenya and Rhaenys got along well for once and organized a small event together. They played matchmaker and started the first social gathering in the Targaryen kingdom, introducing some young noble offspring to suitable partners. Thanks to the efforts of the 2 queens, the 7 kingdoms saw their first cross-border marriages. Aegon was equally delighted and offered his blessings to these young men and women. After the banquet, Aegon threw himself into government affairs. Many matters had piled up and needed his personal attention. For example, the unified laws had been revised repeatedly and continuously improved by the archmaesters and maesters of the law school, and the first version had been approved by most of the lords of the kingdom. After returning to Harrenhal, Aegon immediately ordered all lords to comply with the unified laws, which included the decrees on customs duties, obligations, and taxes were clarified, changing the previous situation where ports and lords arbitrarily oppressed tenants, commoners, and merchants. Clergy and their land and property were exempt from taxes, and the church had the right to judge and punish septons, septa, and members of the faith for illegal acts. Tax reform was at the core of the laws, increasing the kingdom's financial resources and promoting development. Second was Aegon's support for the church, which was proposed by Grand Maester Gon and aimed to win the favor of the faithful for Aegon's ascension to the position of head of the faith of the 7. After the unified laws were promulgated, Aegon was baptized in a small chapel outside Harrenhal and converted to the faith of the 7, causing an uproar in the Targaryen dynasty. Countless people discussed the king's conversion, and many believers were optimistic, believing that it demonstrated the Targaryen dynasty's respect for the 7 gods. With the king as a believer, how could the followers of the 7 dare not respect him? Grand Maester Gon and the High Septon worked hard within the faith of the 7, and Aegon was appointed most devout of the Crownlands in a vote by the faith of the 7, taking charge of all church affairs in the Crownlands. The faith of the 7 did not originally have the title of most devout, but in view of King Aegon's special status, the Council of 7 specifically changed the title of bishop for him. During the Council of 7's vote, House Hightower once again exerted its influence. It was undeniable that House Hightower held considerable influence in the fields of politics and religious governance. Previously, on Old Wick, Aegon had appointed the head of House Hightower as a lord, and at this moment, the royal family and House Hightower were in a honeymoon period. Grand Maester Gon carried Aegon's order and requested that House Hightower support Aegon's appointment as bishop in the vote. House Hightower agreed without hesitation and even used its influence to persuade many septons to vote in favor, repaying a favor with a favor. The Grand Maester Gon, having led the kingdom's religious affairs to such success, naturally received more promises from Aegon, such as future appointments once Aegon took the High Septon's seat. Aegon's elevation to the position of most devout may have seemed smooth, but in truth, it was a difficult feat. This marked the first time in thousands of years on the continent of Westeros that royal authority and religious power were united in one person. Had it not been for Aegon's prestige as the founding monarch, and had it not been for House Hightower persuading key septons to switch sides, no other king could have accomplished such a seemingly impossible act. Time passed, but winter showed no signs of receding. By the end of the 4th year since the conquest, Aegon had turned 18. Shera, the master of whisperers, was pregnant, and the Storm Queen Argilla was also expecting a child. Only Queen Visenya had yet to conceive. During one of her routine sword training sessions, Visenya suddenly found her sword empty of meaning. A wave of frustration washed over her, and in a burst of emotion, she flung the blade to the ground and stormed off in search of Aegon. Weeks passed, and Aegon was now doing his best in bed to make up for what Visenya had been denied, trying to fill the emptiness in her heart. At that moment, a maid reported from outside the chamber. "Your Grace, Queen Rhaenys' water has broken. She is giving birth in the bedchamber." Aegon sprang to his feet in delight. "My first child is about to be born." He and Visenya quickly dressed and hurried to Rhaenys' room. The news that a prince was about to be born brought Harrenhal to life in an instant. Ministers and nobles alike were filled with excitement and curiosity, their faces alight with anticipation. Everyone knew that if the child was a boy, by Westerosi law of primogeniture, he would become the Targaryen crown prince. On his way, Aegon was stopped by hand of the King Torrhen, who smiled and called out, "Your Grace, wait for me." "Yes, let's go together, to witness the arrival of my firstborn, haha," Aegon replied cheerfully, quickening his pace toward Queen Rhaenys' chambers, his vassals close behind. Outside the queen's bedchamber, dozens of lords had already gathered in the corridor. Regardless of gender, the child, being the firstborn of a royal marriage, was destined to enter the kingdom's political core. All present awaited the birth in earnest, their expectations sincere. Some of the great lords were already calculating whether they had any suitable heirs for a potential match with the coming prince or princess. Everyone waited quietly for the arrival of the new life, hoping it would bring renewed hope to House Targaryen. Then came the clear cry of a newborn. The chamber doors slowly opened from within. A maester of the new medicine school stepped out, cradling a wrinkled, red little bundle in his arms. Approaching Aegon, he carefully handed him the child and said with a smile, "May the Seven bless him. It's a healthy prince." Aegon accepted the newborn with trembling joy, carefully cradling the prince in his arms. He gently stroked the child's tiny face, gazing down at the little wrinkled life, eyes filled with tenderness and love. His vassals gathered close to offer their congratulations. "Congratulations, Your Grace, on the birth of a prince. May the Seven bless him to grow into a brave, wise, and kind man. Blessings on the prince, may he enjoy a long and happy life. Your Grace, will you give this lovely prince a name?" Torrhen asked with a smile. Aegon nodded and lifted the newborn high into the air, letting the golden light of morning fall across the baby's delicate face. Smiling warmly, he said with loving pride, "My son, the day you came into this world shall be remembered across all Westeros. Your name will be sung by countless voices. Your name is Aenys Targaryen. Hail House Targaryen. Hail King Aegon. Hail Prince Aenys." Torrhen cried aloud. "Hail to the king. Hail to the prince." The lords echoed joyfully, bursting into cheers. Just then, Aegon felt the silver dragon mark on his forehead grow warm. Two abstract visions surged into his mind. In the first, a king wearing a ruby-studded Valyrian crown moaned in pain on a sickbed in Dragonstone. He was surrounded by fear and uncertainty, frequently jerking awake from nightmares. The second showed a high, overhead view, a map-like perspective, of a castle. Inside, two young people with Targaryen features and silver hair huddled together, trapped in the stronghold. Outside, a horde of ragged, zombie-like refugees pressed in on them. The young pair clung to one another in terror. Aegon blinked back to the present, the identity of the first king immediately clear. The fact that these visions came the moment he held his firstborn son seemed like an omen, that Aenys, though destined to inherit the crown, would not enjoy a smooth reign. In old age, he would suffer illness and be haunted by dread. As for the two youths in the second vision, Aegon guessed they might be Aenys's descendants. But he couldn't fathom how two Targaryens could end up under siege by a mob of starving refugees. That commoners, refugees, would dare raise a hand against members of the royal family. Absurd. Just how far would the royal family's authority have to fall for such audacity to be possible? Lowering his head, Aegon stared down at his newborn son, lost in thought, silent and still. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. P. A Trian Comp. BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon comp BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 2 comments 0 vote. Chapter 92, The Red Keep. Your Grace. Is something wrong? The hand of the king, Torrhen, noticed Aegon staring intently at the baby, his smile having vanished completely, and couldn't help but speak up. Aegon seemed to snap out of his thoughts and replied with a smile, I'm just overjoyed, haha. He handed the baby to the nearby wet nurse, then stepped into the room and immediately saw Rhaenys lying weakly in bed. When she saw her husband enter, Rhaenys quickly gave him a gentle smile. Aegon, I've finally brought hope to you, and to House Targaryen. Aegon's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly composed himself and resumed a seemingly warm expression. He placed a soft kiss on Rhaenys' forehead and said gently, in the month following childbirth, you mustn't get overly emotional or leave the bed, or you might fall ill. You need to rest well. Where's the baby? Have you given him a name? Rhaenys asked, her voice filled with the joy of new motherhood. His name is Aenys, Aegon replied, gently placing her hand against his cheek. He then signaled the wet nurse to bring the child over and place him beside her. Rhaenys lovingly stroked her son's soft, rosy cheek, smiling brightly. Aenys, what a lovely name. You'll surely grow into a great hero, just like your father. He's my firstborn son, Aegon said softly. I will do everything in my power to raise him into a strong and decisive dragonlord. I will. I'll train him carefully, nurture him with the best education, and prepare him to bear the burden of guarding this realm. You'd better mean that, Rhaenys said playfully, tapping Aegon's forehead with her index finger. Aegon gave a slight nod, his expression calm yet tinged with a trace of contemplation. Just moments earlier, he had been carefully weighing his thoughts. From the vision he had seen, Aenys hardly resembled a wise ruler, more like a feeble and indecisive one. That the Targaryen bloodline would come under siege by the people, and that Aenys would spend his final days sick and secluded on Dragonstone instead of ruling from King's Landing, said enough. Aside from Visenya, Aegon had 3 other lovers currently pregnant. In time, he would have more than one heir to choose from. That led to a crucial question, should he choose the most capable, or follow tradition and name the eldest? Choosing the most capable might seem ideal, but in practice, primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, was far more realistic and ensured a smoother transfer of power within the realm. After all, the status of the firstborn son wasn't subject to personal opinion, while judging capability was far too open to manipulation. There are 1,000 hamlets in 1,000 minds, every faction had its own standard for what counted as capable. Self-interest and bias made such judgments too easily swayed. Compared to that, the identity of the firstborn was practically immutable. Even if Aenys turned out incompetent, Aegon now had the foresight, and thus the chance, to guide and reshape him through rigorous training and elite education. He could tailor his son's development to overcome his natural weaknesses. As long as Aenys could grow into a capable monarch, Aegon would never waver in supporting him, and would protect his claim with all his strength. But if, despite Aegon's efforts, Aenys still failed to lead this young empire, only then would he consider choosing a different successor. If that day ever came, Aegon's status as the founding king would make it easy to reassign Aenys, perhaps as a maester, or to the wall as a member of the Night's Watch. Rest well, Aegon said, kissing both Rhaenys and Aenys on the forehead. Then he quietly left the room with the others. The kingdom of Targaryen had welcomed its first prince, a historic event worthy of great celebration. The small council debated whether to hold another tournament and summon the lords to Harrenhal for a grand celebration. But Aegon chose to postpone it, reasoning that the war with the Iron Islands had just ended, and the lords were already busy preparing for the upcoming war with Dorne. Traveling back and forth would be too demanding. Instead, Aegon made a proclamation to all the kingdom's lords. To celebrate Prince Aenys's birth, he would pardon the first group of slaves who had helped build King's Landing, granting them freedom and thereby showcasing the Targaryen dynasty's benevolence. As for vassals too far from the crownlands, they need not make the trip to King's Landing for the ceremony. All focus should remain on the coming war with Dorne. According to the weather maesters, winter was nearing its end, and a new phase of conquest was about to begin. Among the various orders of maesters, most were more theoretical, but the climate maesters were well known for their remarkably accurate seasonal forecasts, rarely making errors. 1 month later, Aegon, along with the 2 queens, young Prince Aenys, several ministers, and noble apprentices from Harrenhal, set out for King's Landing. This time, Aegon and his sisters did not ride their dragons. Instead, they traveled with the ministers aboard a pleasure barge, inspecting the realm along the way and offering comments on development around Harrenhal. Aegon also discussed with his ministers the ongoing construction of the King's Road, which was being spearheaded by the 6 great duchies. This royal highway would span the 7 kingdoms and serve as the backbone of future commerce across Westeros, something Aegon could not afford to overlook. However, construction was still in the surveying stage, with only short sections built just outside the castles of several lords. As the royal fleet followed the Tare, a tributary of the God's Eye, downstream and neared its junction with the Blackwater Rush, Aegon looked out from the ship and saw travelers moving briskly along the dirt roads by the riverbank, merchants and wayfarers among them. Some clever folk had set up a few inns along the banks of the River of Tears, offering food, water, and lodging to passing travelers. Aegon pointed to one of the inns and said to Crispian, "The roads within the Crownlands must be developed with urgency. The road from Harrenhal to King's Landing, for instance, only allows 2 carriages to pass side by side. This is meant to be part of the King's Road. It should match the standards of the Valyrian roads, built with a solid stone foundation and broad enough to be worthy of its name. We must also set up official waystations at regular intervals." Crispian looked uneasy. "Isn't a road as wide as the Valyrian ones, wide enough for 6 carriages, a bit too ambitious? Even if your grace sends tens of thousands of Ironborn to assist, we're still short on manpower. Then make it wide enough for 4 carriages, but ensure the design allows for future expansion." Aegon reluctantly lowered his expectations. The fleet moved from the River of Tears into the Blackwater Rush. Along the riverbanks, they began to see busy Ironborn clearing vegetation from the dirt roads. At that time, Westeros was still largely untamed, overgrown with plant life. The dirt road between Harrenhal and King's Landing had only been gradually formed over the last few years by caravan traffic. Some Ironborn working on the riverside road noticed the royal fleet and shouted excitedly, bowing in respect to the king. To ensure Aegon's safety, Orys had no choice but to persuade him and the ministers to return to the cabin. After spending a brief moment interacting with the Ironborn, Aegon relented and returned to the ship to rest. Carried swiftly by the current, the fleet arrived at the King's Landing construction site by afternoon. It was the end of the 4th year of the conquest. With the arrival of the Ironborn and the slaves from Volantis, nearly 100,000 people were now living and laboring on the construction site of King's Landing. After 4 years of building, the outline of the grand city was beginning to take shape. The Crownlands army had long since placed the area under martial law. All the slaves had been gathered in the square before the inner city. Whispering among themselves, they were filled with excitement. Aegon the Dragonlord had come in person to grant them their freedom. When these tens of thousands of slaves saw Aegon's carriage enter the square, escorted by Targaryen knights, they erupted in wild cheers, praising their king. They dropped to both knees before his carriage, their heads bowed deeply, though many still snuck curious glances at the ornate vehicle from the corners of their eyes. The inner city wall facing the square had already been completed. Built from stone quarried from a nearby red rock mine, the towering structure shimmered with a vivid crimson hue. This wall had been designed by Aegon based on the ancient Valyrian Shield of Freedom. It was built wide enough to allow 9 carriages to ride side by side atop it, so dragons could land and rest. Just as they were now, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes descended slowly from the sky and settled onto the platform atop the red wall. The Black Dread stood in the center, flanked by the other 2, exuding the full majesty of Valyrian dragonlords. Aegon stepped down from his carriage wearing a ruby crown and a regal robe of black and red, embroidered with the 3-headed dragon sigil. In addition to the Targaryen emblem, this new robe also featured a 7-pointed star, marking Aegon's role as the most devout of the Crownlands. He looked up at the towering red wall, smiled, and murmured, "It may not rival the Shield of Freedom in Valyria, but it's a fine landmark all the same." To the slaves, the sight of the Dragonlord was like seeing a god. Most of them were Valyrian descendants carefully selected by Aerion, and they held a deep sense of reverence, nostalgia, and awe for the Dragonlord. Besides the slaves, many worshippers of the 7 from across the Crownlands had also come, having heard of the king's plan to pardon the slaves. As the most devout of the faith, Aegon was deeply beloved by followers of the 7. Balerion's massive tail reached down from the towering wall and came to rest before Aegon's carriage. Aegon gave a slight smile and stepped onto the tail, climbing up the red wall along Balerion's spine. Visenya and Rhaenys watched silently as Aegon and Balerion moved in perfect harmony, no words exchanged, yet fully attuned to each other. Their bond surpassed that of nearly any dragon rider alive. Both sisters couldn't help but think of an ancestor of House Targaryen, the Dragonlord champion. Perhaps only a legendary dragon knight of that caliber could rival Aegon's mastery of dragon riding. When Aegon climbed onto Valyrian's forehead, he turned to look at the inner city beyond the red wall. Only a small portion of the outer court, inner court, and side towers had been built. It was clear now, his design had been far too ambitious. In designing King's Landing's inner city, he had taken inspiration from the ancient city of Valyria, but had failed to account for the fact that Valyria was the result of thousands of years of construction by the Freehold. At this rate, it might take another decade or more before the massive complex of buildings could even be inhabited. Aegon turned back and called out loudly from Valyrian's forehead, "My people, when the construction of King's Landing began, I promised you that after 3 years of labor, I would grant you the status of commoners under the Targaryen dynasty. Now, those 3 years have passed. Your diligence has borne fruit. Today is the day you cast off the chains of slavery." With that, Aegon gave a small wave to the commander of the city garrison waiting below. Immediately, the newly formed red-cloaked city guards moved forward in rows, unlocking the shackles from the slaves' hands and feet. The slaves gazed at their newly freed hands through tear-filled eyes, praying to Aegon with the same reverence they might show a god. Seeing the city guards carrying out his orders, Aegon spoke again. "You will not only be granted the status of commoners, you will also be given homes, and the chance to start your own families. I will lease land to you for farming. And if you return to work on the construction of King's Landing, you will be paid wages. Embrace your new lives, my people." A wave of cheers erupted from below. Aegon looked down at the crowd, pleased with their reaction. This was his intent all along, to steadily grow the population of the Crownlands. In the past, when the Seven Kingdoms were in constant conflict, the Crownlands had been the most fiercely contested battleground. Year after year, the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, and the Westerlands brought war to its soil, leaving the Crownlands with the smallest population of any of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon continued to purchase slaves from Essos, effectively draining the lifeblood of the 9 free cities across the narrow sea. Once those slaves arrived in Westeros, they would never return. They would either die from toil on the construction sites of King's Landing, or survive 3 years to become commoners, rise above their station, settle in new towns established by the Targaryen dynasty, and become part of the Crownlands. Only with a growing population could the economy begin to flourish. And only a prosperous Crownlands would attract people from the other 6 regions, creating a healthy cycle where the core grew stronger and the outer regions more reliant. At present, the population of the Crownlands was barely 2 million. Aegon's goal was to increase that number tenfold within 10 years, a feat that would require a massive influx of immigrants. Slaves, wildlings, smugglers, Aegon welcomed them all. He and his ministers stayed in King's Landing for several weeks, primarily inspecting the progress on the construction sites. During that time, Rhaenys, noting that the inner city was being built from red stone, gave it a beautiful name, the Red Keep. The Targaryen court spent the final day of the 4th year of the conquest in King's Landing and stepped into the 5th. When the royal party returned to Harrenhal, a raven arrived at the Raven Tower with news. The 7 Sea Kings, 7 recognized pirate crews from the Iron Islands, were gathering fleets and preparing to sail south. They had requested that the ports along their route provide them with necessary supplies. These 7 pirate groups had each assembled their own fleet and were heading toward the coast of Dorne to collect iron money. Lord Hightower, head of House Hightower, wrote to Aegon seeking guidance, should they grant the pirates' request. The Sea King's report indicated they intended to use the port of Aldtown as their base of operations. Aegon replied instructing Lord Hightower to fully support the raiding campaign, while warning House Hightower not to impose excessive taxes on the pirates' loot. "This is just a little appetizer before the conquest of Dorne," Aegon remarked during the small council. "The hand of the king," Torrhen warned, "Your Grace, supporting bandits is dishonorable." Aegon simply smiled and gave no reply. Torrhen was rigid, too traditional. After the Dornish War, Aegon planned to send his old friend home to rest and appoint a more compliant hand. Winter is nearing its end. The dukes must begin gathering their warriors to support the conquest of Dorne, Orys said. As Marshal of the Realm, he naturally held a seat on the small council and was directly involved in the campaign planning. Several lords and councillors voiced their agreement, expressing enthusiasm for the new war. The conquest of the Iron Islands had made 3 of them incredibly rich, how could the rest not be tempted? Aegon was the first to leave the meeting, leaving the details of the Dornish campaign to Orys and the others. He had no need to micromanage. Lately, Aegon was most interested in spending time with his two-month-old son, Aenys, and in following the research progress at the new citadel. His earlier work on papermaking had made great strides. He believed success was close at hand. And once papermaking was complete, other inventions like printing would follow more easily. It was the economic power of these new technologies that gave Aegon the confidence to believe he could multiply the Crownlands' population fivefold within 10 years. Aegon realized he had fallen into a trap of his own making. When researching papermaking, he had poured an enormous number of destiny points into chip-assisted simulations. But the return was negligible, the points were spent like water and depleted in no time. Even if Aegon had 10 kidneys generating destiny points, it still wouldn't be enough. Eventually, he shifted strategy, assigning these projects to the appropriate maester schools. Only when they hit a bottleneck would he intervene with chip-based simulations. This reduced the cost in destiny points significantly while drastically improving efficiency. One such project, the rail-based public carriage system, had already been completed. Rails drastically reduced resistance and increased stability. Without needing additional horses, the rail carriages could travel at twice the speed of traditional ones, carry double the number of passengers, and reduce the accident rate to one-eighth of that of standard wagons. Iron ore from the Iron Islands was smelted into rails and laid near Harrenhal. This new form of urban transport was expected to be up and running soon. The maester who led the rail carriage project was rewarded by Aegon with the fief of a small village. From that point on, enthusiasm among the maesters surged. Many nobles also began investing in projects favored by King Aegon. He welcomed their participation in high-potential ventures and didn't turn them away. The royal family always retained 51% of the shares in each project, while distributing a modest portion of profits to the vassals. This helped create a broad alliance of shared interests, an invaluable asset for Aegon's future political reforms and commercial development. At Harrenhal's academic towers, the Eagle Tower, the Wolf Tower, and the Lion Tower all had research projects assigned by Aegon. Only the Dragon Tower had relatively few. After all, Aegon couldn't entrust Valyrian blood sorcery to outsiders. Moreover, much of the existing magic was overly obscure and abstract. During an inspection of the Dragon Tower, Aegon had seen numerous experiments that bordered on the inhumane. Many magical items crafted through dark sorcery were utterly impractical. For example, a sluggish voodoo zombie that couldn't even match the combat strength of a farmer wielding a pitchfork. Aegon had particular interest in the study of skin changers, but Harrenhal's Dragon Tower had made no progress in this area. No skin changers had come forward to collaborate. There were no known direwolves among Torrhen Stark's generation, and none of the Northern Bannerman's retainers had shown such abilities. Or perhaps skin changers did exist, but as followers of the old gods, they were unwilling to have their gifts dissected and studied. Aegon planned to find an opportunity to visit Dragonstone and ask old Nan, Ilya, whether she'd be willing to teach at the Dragon Tower. Ilya lived in seclusion on Dragonstone, having never revealed her true identity or powers. Aegon didn't feel it appropriate to summon her by letter. He would have to wait and act in accordance with her own wishes. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 2 comments 0 vote. Chapter 93, The Renaissance of Valyria. By mid-year of the 5th year of the conquest, the sun had grown steadily fiercer, and the temperature slowly began to rise. The long winter, which had lasted for 2.5 years, was finally showing signs of coming to an end. From the direction of Aldtown, alarming reports of raids by the 7 Sea Kings arrived with increasing frequency. In Dorne, the first to suffer at the hands of the Ironborn was House Dane of Starfall. The Ironborn swept through like a tidal wave, looting massive amounts of food and coin, which they then hauled back to Aldtown in grand procession. For a time, the Ironborn of the 7 Sea Kings grew rich beyond measure, reaping enormous profits. As a special organization directly under the king, the 7 Sea Kings were exempt from paying taxes to any liege lords for the iron money they seized at sea. They were only required to offer a portion of their spoils as tribute to the royal family. Aegon would occasionally receive these tributes, goods from Dorne and rare treasures. Sometimes it was antique weapons, other times, it was Dornish women. But Aegon no longer indulged recklessly. He already had 5 women, each of beauty beyond compare. What more could he ask for? During this time, Aegon once flew on Balerion to Sunspear, the royal seat of Dorne. Yet upon arriving, he found the palace completely abandoned. Dorne's current ruler, Princess Marya Martell, the Yellow Toad, seemed utterly determined to resist House Targaryen to the bitter end. Having made the arduous journey in vain through winter, Aegon was furious. In his anger, he ordered Balerion to burn down Sunspear's royal palace. But no sooner had the fire died down than dozens of scorpions appeared, unleashing a storm of thick bolts at Balerion like a swarm of locusts. Balerion, however, was no fragile creature like the dragons of House Velaryon. The bolts clanged off his scales, sparking and ringing with the sharp sound of metal against metal. Aegon was consumed by fury. He commanded Balerion to incinerate the crossbowmen where they stood. Then, circling Sunspear atop his dragon, he declared for all to hear, anyone who refused to submit to the Targaryen kingdom would face total annihilation. Aegon left Dorne in frustration. Along his return route, every Dornish stronghold he passed took a shot at him with scorpions. Clearly, someone had spotted Balerion in flight and raised the alarm. Dorne had prepared for war and believed they could bring down the dragon. Aegon hadn't expected such stubborn resistance. Though he refrained from destroying those castles, he issued a stern warning. Any who dared attack the Dragonlord again and refused to submit would be put to the sword. Not long after Aegon returned to Harrenhal, a letter from the Yellow Toad, Marya Martell, landed on his desk. In it, Marya brazenly declared, the people of Dorne will never kneel, and went on to denounce Aegon as the degenerate spawn of the Dragonlords of Valyria. She demanded that he lift the naval blockade imposed by the Federal Council, compensate for the destruction of the Sunspear Palace, and hand over the 7 Sea Kings to House Martell for execution, or else Dorne would show him the true meaning of relentless vengeance. Aegon laughed at the absurdity of her demands. Whatever illusions he had left about peace with Dorne were gone. He immediately ordered Orys to begin preparing military supplies and to muster the kingdom's armies. King Aegon of the Targaryen dynasty issued a royal conquest decree. All lands of the enemy state Dorne were now declared terra nullius, no man's land. Whoever could conquer them would be granted rightful ownership, protected under Targaryen law. The moment this decree was announced, nearly every lord in Westeros sprang into action, stockpiling food, rallying troops, and marching toward the Targaryen-Dorne border. Within a month, the head of House Greyjoy, one of the 7 Sea Kings, declared the successful capture of a small fortress known as Sandstone. Aegon immediately issued a royal proclamation, affirming that House Greyjoy's claim to Sandstone was sacred and inviolable. The lords of the realm grew even more eager. 2 months passed. Winter had faded, and early spring arrived. All across Westeros, life returned in full bloom. In the past half-year, aside from preparations for the Dornish campaign, the most significant development had been the emergence of the new citadel in Harrenhal. Public rail carriages were now running smoothly in the area, shuttling daily between several nearby markets on a fixed schedule. Each carriage was built extra-large, capable of holding more than 20 passengers. These animal-powered rail coaches were hardly different from the buses Aegon had known in his previous life. Tracks were also being laid in the direction of Dorne, providing logistical support for transporting military supplies to the front. Witnessing the tangible success of these inventions, the nobles of the realm began investing heavily in the citadel's projects. A flood of capital poured into Harrenhal. The Dragonlord's treasury received its second major deposit, and the maesters of the citadel began enjoying a far more comfortable life. Under Grand Maester Gon's deliberate promotion, and some strategic exaggeration, many maesters from Aldtown began migrating north to Harrenhal. Their arrival caused the number of resident maesters there to surge to nearly 2,000, transforming the citadel into a thriving hub of learning. With such a vast pool of talent at his disposal, Aegon was able to relaunch a number of research projects that had previously been shelved. During this unique period, the Alchemist's Lion Tower became a focal point of Aegon's attention. It housed several of his most carefully overseen projects, including papermaking, steel refining, cement production, ice making, soap crafting, and more. These advanced innovations were all initiated by Aegon himself. Although results were still some way off, he was confident that once society reached a certain threshold, a technological explosion would follow, one that would completely transform the light industry landscape of Westeros. Meanwhile, the maesters of the Eagle Tower likely had the hardest lives in the new citadel. Their work in cultural and philosophical studies produced no immediate results, and cultural development itself was a slow, gradual process, one that required time, reflection, and deep accumulation. Aegon had initially shared with them elements of ancient Valyrian culture, but with little success. He then introduced philosophies from the ancient Eastern civilizations of his past life. Perhaps due to his own deep exposure to Eastern traditions, Aegon's explanations were clearer and more engaging, leading to much faster uptake among the Eagle Tower scholars. He provided them with a range of philosophical frameworks, among which Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Mohism, and the school of diplomacy were the most favored, each offering overarching systems of thought. Some schools that embraced the new doctrines even renamed themselves after the 100 schools of thought. For example, the school previously focused on legal principles rebranded itself as the School of Law, a blending of East and West. Amid the exchange and synthesis among nearly 1,000 cultural scholars, something remarkable was taking shape in Harrenhal's Eagle Tower. Aegon felt that a new and unfamiliar cultural identity was being born there. It was like a newborn child, and in this metaphor, he was its father, and the maesters its many mothers. Together, they were nurturing the birth of a new civilization. This process could take decades, or even centuries, but the thrill of shaping a culture with his own hands filled Aegon with joy. These weren't biological offspring, but this culture, this vision, brought him more fulfillment than even his own bloodline. At the close of winter, in the latter half of the 5th year of the conquest, the Targaryen dynasty was ready. The war for Dorne had officially begun. Rhaenys intended to ride Meraxes to Sunspear, hoping to make one last effort to convince Marya Martell, the Yellow Toad, to surrender. But as Aegon watched his sister-wife ascend into the sky on Meraxes, he was suddenly struck by a chilling vision from his apocalypse dream trace, the brutal death of Rhaenys and her dragon. In that vision, atop the tallest tower of a fortress, a guard loosed a massive scorpion bolt, an iron arrow a yard long, that struck Meraxes directly in the right eye. Though the dragon didn't die instantly, it plummeted to the ground in agony. The vision left Aegon frozen in place, stunned. He only snapped out of it when Rhaenys was nearly out of sight. At once, he leapt onto Balerion and soared after her. Cursing internally, he thought, the Dornish must be absurdly lucky. Meraxes and Vhagar are both over 40 meters long, fully grown dragons with scales harder than steel. And yet they managed to hit the eye with one bolt. Really? Aegon managed to intercept Rhaenys in time and forced her to turn back. Frustrated, she returned to Harrenhal and sulked in silence. She had hoped to earn merit and bolster her son Aenys's prestige. With Visenya holding such high status at court, Rhaenys feared she might become an obstacle to her son's future claim to the throne. Following this episode, the Targaryen armies began their campaign. Marshal Orys Baratheon led a force of 10,000 elite knights through the Boneway. Aegon himself marched with an army of 50,000 toward the Prince's Pass. His host included nearly 3,000 mounted knights and 300 lords of various ranks. The army was made up of troops from the Crownlands and the Reach, personally commanded by King Aegon of House Targaryen. Lord Hightower, Warden of the South, even claimed that the army could crush any Dornish resistance, even without Aegon and his dragon Balerion. He had good reason to believe this, though he'd find no proof on the battlefield, for the Dornish refused to give battle. Instead, they retreated step by step before Aegon's advance, burning crops and poisoning every well behind them. The Targaryen army discovered that all the watchtowers in the Red Mountains had been abandoned. Every pass had been sealed off with walls made from the rotting carcasses of shorn sheep, useless for food and blocked off for good. By the time the army emerged from the Prince's Pass and crossed into the Dornish desert, their provisions and fodder were already running low. Aegon split his forces. He ordered Lord Hightower to march south and confront Lord Uther Uller of Hellhold, while he himself turned east to lay siege to Lord Fowler's mountain stronghold at Skyreach. It was early spring, and though there was still a lingering chill in the air, rainfall was plentiful. The soldiers of House Targaryen hoped the desert heat would ease soon, and that the spring rains would become more frequent, making it easier to find water. But on Lord Hightower's march toward Hellhold, Dorne's sun remained as merciless as ever. In the punishing heat, the men desperately needed water, but every pond and oasis along the route had been poisoned. Horses began dying in droves, and the situation worsened rapidly. With their mounts lost, many riders soon collapsed themselves. Even the proud knights were forced to abandon their banners, shields, and eventually even their armor. By the time Lord Hightower finally reached Hellhold, Having lost a quarter of his force and nearly all his horses, he found nothing but an abandoned fortress. Orys Baratheon faced hardships of his own. His cavalry had to struggle through narrow, twisting passes and steep, rocky slopes. In the steepest places, the Dornish had carved stairs directly into the mountainside, rendering them impassable to horses, which had to be left behind. Rocks rained down from above, crashing onto the knights under the command of the Hand of the King, an ambush unlike anything the men of the Crownlands had ever seen. At the point where the Boneway crossed the Will River, Dornish archers suddenly emerged and loosed thousands of arrows on the cavalry as they crossed the bridge. Marshal Orys ordered a retreat, but it was too late, a landslide cut off their escape. Caught in a trap, the Crownlands soldiers were like pigs penned for slaughter. In the end, only Orys Baratheon and a dozen lords deemed valuable enough for ransom were spared. They were taken captive by the savage mountain lords, ruled by Will, the infamous, widow's lover, of Will Castle. Aegon, meanwhile, made far greater progress. He led his forces east along the foothills, where mountain streams provided fresh water and the valleys teemed with game. He launched a direct assault on Skyreach and captured it. After a brief siege, Euronwood fell as well. The Lord of Tor had recently passed, and the Castellans surrendered the city without a fight. The king's army pushed further east. At Ghost Hill, Lord Toland sent a proxy knight to challenge Aegon. Aegon accepted and slew the man in single combat, only to discover he hadn't been a real knight at all, but merely Toland's court jester. Lord Toland used the distraction to flee. When King Aegon arrived at Sunspear atop Balerion, Princess Marya Martell followed Toland's example. The king's army continued its campaign, capturing Lemonwood, Spotswood, and Stinkwater Keep in quick succession. They were greeted by crones and children alike, but still saw no sign of the true Dornish army. Even the outer fortress of Sunspear was nearly deserted. Those who remained couldn't say where the Dornish lords or the princess had gone. The yellow toad has melted into the sand, Grand Maester Gon reported to King Aegon. Aegon responded by declaring victory. In Sunspear's Great Hall, he gathered the remaining noblemen of Dorne and solemnly proclaimed the annexation of Dorne into the unified kingdom, ordering them to swear loyalty as his vassals. He denounced their former rulers as traitors and rebels, placing bounties on their heads, none higher than the one on Princess Marya Martell, the so-called Yellow Toad. He appointed John Rosby as acting Castellan of Sunspear and Warden of the Sands, to govern Dorne in the king's name. Other conquered cities and castles were each assigned governors and provisional lords. Aegon spent the new year of the 6th year of the conquest in Sunspear. Afterward, he led his army westward through the hill country and then north through the Prince's Pass, retracing their original path. But before Aegon even returned to King's Landing, Dorne erupted in rebellion under the leadership of Princess Marya Martell, the Yellow Toad. When the news reached him in King's Landing, Aegon flew into a rage and issued a proclamation to all of Westeros. I will wipe out House Martell and every Dornish noble who betrayed me, until none remain alive. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. Chapter 94, The Skinner of the Dreadfort. While Aegon was still seething with rage over the betrayal, soldiers from the north arrived at Harrenhal, having marched down from the Riverlands. Because winter receded later in the north, the Hand of the King's army was delayed. Hand of the King Torrhen had remained in Harrenhal to assist Queen Visenya with governance and coordination of military logistics. The northern lords, hardened by harsh living conditions, were naturally fierce and resilient. If the Ironborn were savage and reckless, the Northmen were battle-hardened and unyielding. Aegon's display of power on the southern bank of the Trident, combined with his winter tax exemption policy after conquering the north, had earned him the favor of the North's lords and people alike. So, in this campaign against Dorne, the North responded in full. Virtually every noble house answered Aegon's call to arms, assembling a force of over 40,000 men. Aegon received the northern vassals in the Hall of 100 Hearths at Harrenhal, delivering a fierce and impassioned speech to rally them for war. The king sat on the throne, his expression dark, his fury palpable. Everyone in the hall could feel the Dragonlord's wrath. At that moment, the Lord of the Dreadfort, head of House Bolton, stepped forward and loudly addressed the king. Your Grace, why be angered by such fickle scum? Treachery runs in the blood of the Dornish. They were never worthy of your mercy. Only the North understands your grace. These rats that burrow in the desert, we'll make them pay for betraying you. House Bolton, one of the most powerful noble houses in the north, traced its lineage to the first men in the Age of Heroes. It was infamous for flaying its enemies alive. Aegon rose and stepped down from the throne. He approached Lord Bolton, placing a hand on his shoulder with a calm expression. "You speak the truth," he said. Lord Bolton quickly lowered his head in deference. Aegon's eyes settled on the pink flayed man emblazoned on Bolton's chest, then locked with the Lord's dark green gaze. "Are my blades still sharp?" Aegon asked solemnly. Delighted that the king understood their family motto, Lord Bolton responded eagerly, "Yes, your grace. Our blades are ever at your service." "Good," Aegon nodded. "I've heard that in the Age of Heroes, your house took great pride in flaying enemies and wearing their skins into battle." Lord Bolton seemed to understand Aegon's intent. Overcome with excitement, he began trembling as he replied, voice unsteady, "Yes, that's true, your grace. We believe power can be drawn from the skins of our enemies. It's just." He hesitated, his gaze drifting instinctively to hand of the King Torrhen Stark, whose stern and piercing glare silenced him. Reluctantly, he lowered his head and fixed his eyes on Aegon's boots. Torrhen, perceiving Aegon's intent, attempted to intervene. "Your grace, this ancient custom of House Bolton has been outlawed in the north for thousands of years." In response, Aegon drew Blackfire and held it angled toward the floor. Seeing this, Lord Bolton was elated. He dropped to one knee, bowed low, and waited in reverent silence for what he clearly saw as a sacred moment for House Bolton. Aegon rested the blade lightly on Bolton's shoulder and spoke with gravity. "I am a man who respects the traditions of Westeros. Just as I reopened the ancient paths of the Ironborn and embraced the faith of the Seven, I believe the nature of House Bolton should not be buried. In the name of Aegon I, King of the Targaryen dynasty, I grant House Bolton the right to resume the ancient rite of flaying, limited solely to enemies of the realm, the Dornish. This is my justice for Dorne's betrayal." Before Aegon had even finished speaking, Torrhen Stark turned and stormed out of the Hall of 100 Hearths in fury. Lord Bolton, meanwhile, prostrated himself with both hands on the ground, kissing Aegon's boots like a loyal hound, loudly swearing his allegiance and showering praise on Aegon I for his wise and glorious decision. Among the gathered lords, those close to House Stark were visibly uneasy about Aegon's controversial decree. Still, bound by caution and respect for the founding king, they kept their disapproval to themselves. Unlike Torrhen, they did not dare walk out. They knew they were not counted among Aegon's trusted allies, and if they crossed him publicly, he would have many ways to deal with them. Thus ended the strange and uneasy audience with the lords of the north. With Orys taken captive by the Dornish, the role of Lord Marshal was now vacant. Aegon appointed Lord Bolton to serve as acting Marshal of the realm, temporarily assuming Orys Baratheon's duties. Like the Seven Sea Kings of the Iron Islands, the ancient practices of House Bolton were only permitted during wartime against foreign enemies. Once Dorne was fully subdued, both the flaying customs of the Boltons and the special privileges of the Ironborn would be once again sealed away. This was the argument Aegon had used to placate Torrhen. Otherwise, with Torrhen's blunt and principled nature, he might have cast aside the badge of the hand and returned to Winterfell, washing his hands of royal affairs. At the following military council for the Dorne campaign, Lord Bolton eagerly proposed strategies, while Torrhen Stark remained stone-faced, but did not neglect his responsibilities. Aegon had reworked his plan for Dorne. In the previous war, he had relied on traditional tactics, massive armies advancing in formation, to conquer the north, the Vale, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, the Reach, and the Iron Islands. With Balerion at his side, he was nearly invincible. But the underhanded methods of Princess Meria and the fickle betrayals of Dorne's lords had dealt the Targaryen army a harsh blow. Now the Dornish were waging guerrilla war, retreating when pursued, harassing when encamped, striking when weary, fleeing when pressured. Aegon and his council repeatedly simulated the campaign and came to a hard truth: Dorne's tenacity meant there could be no swift conquest. Total victory would have to be achieved gradually. The War Council laid out the following strategic directives for the conquest of Dorne. First, enforce a naval and land blockade of the Dornish kingdom. Use a concentric strategy to occupy territory gradually, shrinking the borders and reducing the Dornishmen's living space bit by bit. Second, relocate the Dornishmen living in occupied territories. The Six Kingdoms were all constructing segments of the King's Road. These Dornishmen could be sent to work on the roads. King's Landing was also short on labor. With spring approaching, the Crown lands had much uncultivated land that needed tilling. If the relocated Dornish could be assimilated, they would help grow the population of the Crown Lands, something Aegon had long sought. This was an opportunity. Third, psychological tactics were to be employed, spreading word of Princess Yellowfrog's crimes among all Dornishmen, placing the blame for their suffering squarely on House Martell, while offering favorable treatment to certain Dornish nobles who had surrendered and refrained from rebellion. By treating them differently, the aim was to foster goodwill toward the Targaryen dynasty and gradually achieve cultural integration. In his past life, Aegon had witnessed far too many brutal and inhumane wars. He had no shortage of ruthless methods to treat the Dornish. And while the concept of justice is murky in wars between nations, the Dornish were, after all, part of Westeros. Aegon did not want his realm to become a nation without conscience or limits. Once the strategy was finalized, the army of the north began marching toward Dorne's border. Some fortunate soldiers were able to ride the rail-drawn carriages, a new form of transport, to the southern reaches of Westeros. At present, railways were not yet suited for large-scale deployment. Aegon had laid tracks only near Harrenhal and along the path leading into Dorne. These areas were patrolled day and night, as the value of steel made theft a constant threat. Meanwhile, rebellions flared across Dorne like desert flowers blooming after a rainstorm. Skyreach, Euronwood, Tor, and Ghost Hill were retaken by the Dornish in under 2 weeks. The royal garrisons in those locations were slaughtered, and the governors and castellans appointed by Aegon were only permitted to die after prolonged and torturous suffering. According to Aegon's intelligence, the Dornish lords had even placed bets on who could keep a prisoner alive the longest while dismembering them. As for the acting castellan of Sunspear and warden of the desert, Lord Rosby, he was, relatively speaking, one of the luckier ones. When the Dornish surged out of Shadow City and reclaimed the castle, he was bound hand and foot, dragged to the top of the Spear Tower, and personally thrown out the window by the elderly Princess Maria. Now, only Lord Hightower and his army remained in Dorne, having been personally assigned to stay behind by Aegon. Hellholt, once considered an unbreakable fortress along the Sulphurous River, proved vulnerable in an unexpected way. The sulphurous fish caused illness among the Riverlanders. The Seven Sea King's position in Sandstone was recaptured by House Corgyle. Viken Greyjoy sustained serious injuries but narrowly escaped. Corgyle spearmen then moved west, eliminating Hightower's foraging and patrol parties that had ventured too far. To the east, House Vaith of Vaith Castle destroyed the Hightower army's eastern detachment. When news of the defenestration at Sunspear reached Hellholt, Lord Hightower rallied his remaining forces and set off into the desert. He declared his intention to first conquer Vaith Castle, then move downstream to retake Sunspear and Shadow City, and bring justice to those who had murdered Lord Rosby. But somewhere in the Red Sands east of Hellholt, the head of House Hightower and his entire army vanished without a trace. No one ever saw another soul from that army again. Thus fell the first Warden of the South, the first Lord of Riverrun. At this moment, the northern host arrived at the border of Dorne. Lord Bolton, as Marshal of the army, assumed command of the remaining Riverlands forces. The northern lords' armies crossed the Red Mountains and were the first to retake Skyreach, the fortress closest to the border. According to several reports Aegon received, Lord Bolton launched a brutal and horrifying reprisal the very day Skyreach was recaptured. Before the eyes of tens of thousands of Dornishmen, he skinned the traitorous nobles alive, then draped their hides over his shoulders as a cloak. The reports noted that some Dornishmen were so frightened by his cruelty that they lost control of their bowels. From that moment on, the flayed man of House Bolton became the stuff of nightmares for all Dornishmen, capable even of stopping a crying child in the night. Aegon read in one report that after Lord Bolton donned the human skin cloak, he visibly grew a few inches taller, and red mist would occasionally rise from the garment. He regretted not using a chip to analyze Lord Bolton's talents back in the Hall of 100 Hearths, but there was no doubt that the man was incredibly powerful. After reclaiming Skyreach, the northern host pushed on. They retook Euronwood and Sandstone before advancing to Hellholt. The Reach soldiers trapped inside, cut off from all aid, wept with joy at the sight of the northern reinforcements. Lord Bolton absorbed the Reachmen into his command and proceeded to carry out a second large-scale, cloakmaking, operation at Hellholt. He built a gruesome display out of the bloodied, skinless corpses and arranged them before Hellholt's gates as a warning to any Dornish who dared resist the Targaryens. Lord Bolton's grotesque tactics infuriated the Dornish, but facing the crushing might of the north, they could do little more than conduct nighttime raids and poison the soldiers' supplies. Yet the Targaryens would not be fooled twice, and every such attempt was thwarted under Lord Bolton's watch. The Northern Army halted its advance for the time being, as Hellholt now served as a fortified bridgehead deep inside Dorne. To press further, they would have to cross the vast Red Desert, an unsafe undertaking for an army with no experience in desert warfare. After all, Lord Hightower had once led over 10,000 men into that same sea of sand, and not a single ripple had returned. The head of House Bolton began implementing the encirclement, containment, and fortification strategies developed alongside Aegon and the small council. Groups of Dornishmen were rounded up by northern soldiers and placed under strict military control. As these local Dornish youths were subdued, raids against the Northern Army dropped noticeably. Following the arrival of the Second Army mobilized from the Crownlands, the process of transporting Dornish captives from the camps back to the Crownlands began. Aegon ordered the Logistics Corps to extend the railroad further into Dorne, reaching as far as the Red Mountains. Troops were assigned to patrol the tracks around the clock. With the use of rail carriages, the relocation of Dornish prisoners became much more efficient. The Federal Council of Volantis had already dispatched several groups of slave overseers, ensuring there would be no shortage of personnel to manage and tame the Dornish. Upon arrival in the Crownlands, the Dornish were automatically granted the status of Targaryen commoners, since slavery was prohibited in Westeros. However, each was subject to a 3-year term of penal labor. Only after completing this term would they be granted full freedom. Simultaneously, a propaganda campaign targeting House Martell of Dorne was launched. House Dane of Starfall, which had not joined the rebellion, was rewarded by the Targaryen kingdom. Aegon dispatched propagandists to several large castles throughout the Red Mountains to shape public opinion, highlighting, for example, tax reductions in Starfall, automatic citizenship and business privileges for its people, and the awarding of an honorary medal by Aegon himself to the current head of House Dane in Harrenhal. At this stage of the Targaryen dynasty, the top priority was to consolidate control over the occupied regions of the Red Mountains, while relocating Dornish populations from around military encampments and the most defiant areas of resistance. The goal was to gradually erode House Martell's influence in the region. By the end of the 5th year of the conquest, Prince Aenys had begun calling Aegon, father. From what could be seen, Aenys showed signs of intelligence and behaved like a normal child, just a bit thin and frail. At the new citadel in Harrenhal, an invention of world-shaking significance was successfully completed. Thanks to calculations supported by Aegon's chip, paper was finally produced. Lightweight, portable, and easily replicated, paper made it possible to spread knowledge and information far more widely. This gave a massive boost to the Targaryens' propaganda efforts against Dorne. Even in Aegon's former modern world, leaflets, simple and cheap to produce, remained widely used during wars. But the significance of paper extended far beyond propaganda. It held revolutionary potential in education, knowledge transmission, art, and cultural exchange. For example, the new civilization being cultivated by Aegon and the scholarly circles of the Tower of Learning would see their development time drastically shortened thanks to this breakthrough. Within just half a year, the dozens of academic schools within the Tower of Eagles had already developed more than 10 new philosophical movements, blending Valyrian thought with ideas from the East. These included naturalism, materialism, idealism, restraint, humanism, and more. At present, these philosophies remained in their infancy. Still immature, they required testing and refinement through real-world application before Aegon would grant them official sanction for public dissemination. Shifts in thinking and philosophical transformation were expected to ignite sweeping changes, cultural, political, scientific, and artistic, throughout the Targaryen realm. Of course, any change in human thought carried inherent risks. As Chancellor of the new citadel and one of the founders of these emerging schools of thought, Aegon was confident in his ability to steer their development. He continued to sift through these new ideologies, seeking those most suitable for the Targaryen dynasty's future. But so far, none had fully met his expectations. Further refinement was needed. Still young, Aegon was in no hurry. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 3 comments 0 vote. Chapter 95, The Year of the Dragonlord's Wrath. The war between the Targaryen dynasty and Dorne had reached a fever pitch. Princess Yellowtoad led her armies in multiple fierce assaults on Hellhold, but the fortress's garrison continued to grow, rendering Dorne's attacks increasingly futile. Troops from the Stormlands, the Vale, and the Westerlands also poured into the battlefield, joining the brutal conflict. After over half a year of back-and-forth fighting, the Dornish finally abandoned their attempt to reclaim Hellhold. One castle after another in the Red Mountains was slowly devoured by the monstrous force of the Targaryen kingdom. The rebellious lords of the mountains were ruthlessly flayed by Lord Bolton and turned into gruesome warnings to others. Nearly 10 mountain strongholds were gradually infeft to lords within the realm. The Boneway had already been retaken by the Targaryen army, but its nobles had long since fled, vanishing with Targaryen captives in tow. Thanks to their exceptional performance in the war, House Bolton was granted lordship over Hellhold. This vital stronghold in the heart of Dorne became the crowning glory of House Bolton. After the failed attempt to take Hellhold, Princess Yellowtoad was disheartened and completely gave up Dorne's eastern territories. Leading the Dornish forces, she withdrew in disarray into the Red Desert. Though the intensity of the fighting appeared to wane, everyone knew that once the Targaryen dynasty had fully digested the lands of the Red Mountains and relocated enough of the Dornish population, it would once again tighten the noose around the Martell regime. As the 5th year of the conquest drew to a close, King Aegon's two lovers, Shera, the Master of Whisperers, and Lady Argilla, each gave birth to a son. Aegon named them Maeghan and Mond. Neither of these children bore the Waters surname traditionally given to bastards of the Crownlands. Maeghan, the son of Shera, was destined to enter the Federal Council and eventually succeed his grandfather Aerion as Speaker of the Council. Mond, son of Lady Argilla, inherited the Durrandon name from birth and was fated to one day wear the Stormlands crown. When former Storm King Argillac heard of his grandson's birth, he returned from Volantis to Westeros. Aegon looked upon the aging Argillac and saw that the once formidable warrior who had stood against him outside Storm's End was gone. Now he was but an ordinary old man, his face drawn, his vigor lost, the years etched deep into his features. Reflecting on the conquest of the Stormlands, which had taken place just over 4 years ago, Aegon couldn't help but feel the weight of time's passing. During this period, the royal family often flew to the palace in Highgarden for respite, and Aegon used these trips to visit Lady Rhaedel, who was nearing childbirth. Time passed swiftly, and before long, the 6th year of the conquest had begun. Lady Rhaedel gave birth safely, and Aegon welcomed another son. Seeing the boy's green hair, he joyfully named him Garth. Unfortunately, Garth was not granted any noble title, becoming the first of Aegon's children to bear the bastard surname, Garth Flowers. Aegon had yet to decide the boy's future. Perhaps one day, Garth Flowers would inherit his mother's position as steward of Highgarden and pursue the vacant title of Lord of the Riverlands. After all, the army of the Reach, led by Lord Hightower, had been completely annihilated in Dorne's Red Desert. The resulting blow to the Reach's strength left it with nothing to show for the campaign, and left the Riverlands' dukedom unclaimed. In contrast, House Bolton of the North emerged from the war with Dorne covered in glory. Rumors now spread throughout the realm that House Bolton might be granted the title of Lord of Dorne. But Aegon disagreed. He still valued his friendship with Torrhen too much to let politics drive a wedge between them. On a brighter note, 2 major constructions in King's Landing were completed: Aegon's Hall, one of the Red Keep's 3 outer halls, and Visenya Tower, one of the 3 inner palace towers. Aegon held court with his ministers in Aegon's Hall, followed by a grand ball to celebrate the successful first phase of construction in the capital. The Targaryen royal family moved into Visenya Tower, but other towers meant for courtiers, such as the Tower of the Hand, the Maidenbow, and the Sword Tower, had only just broken ground. With no other choice, Aegon and Visenya returned to Harrenhal to handle state affairs, and the royal household relocated back to Harrenhal with them. The war to conquer Dorne had now lasted a full year. In that time, the most notable development was the explosion in King's Landing's labor force, which surpassed 100,000. Many former slaves had resettled near the capital and begun forming satellite towns. The number of Dornish laborers building the King's Road was even greater. They were working tirelessly to construct the road linking Harrenhal to King's Landing. Designed to accommodate 4 horse-drawn carriages side by side, the road was paved with stone and already halfway completed, expected to be finished by year's end. The Crownlands' population continued to rise over the course of the year, increasing by more than 200,000. Now, with spring in full bloom, the influx of laborers had been put to work in the fields, easing the pressure from population growth without placing any burden on the realm. On the front lines of Hellholt, large-scale land battles had devolved into countless bloody atrocities, acts of looting, and cycles of revenge, punctuated by long periods of stalemate, a dozen brief truces, and more assassinations and betrayals than anyone could count. At the beginning of the 6th year of the conquest, Orys Baratheon and the lords who had been captured with him on the Boneway were finally ransomed back to King's Landing by paying their weight in gold. Those who greeted them were shocked to discover that the widow's lover had cruelly severed the sword hands of every captive, ensuring they would never again be able to take up arms against Dorne. Though Orys's strength was greatly diminished after the loss of his hand, Aegon nonetheless reinstated him as commander of the army and appointed the head of House Bolton as his deputy. During a royal assembly at the Targaryen court, Aegon solemnly promised before all his advisors that one day, he would grant Sunspear, the capital of Dorne, to Orys as the seat of House Baratheon. In Aegon's hall, Orys was moved to tears, an image hard to imagine for a man so hardened. One could only wonder what horrors he had endured at the hands of the Dornish. After the council, driven by a burning hatred for Dorne, Orys immediately returned to the front lines. To avenge the atrocities committed against Orys by House Will of Dorne, King Aegon personally mounted Balerion and flew over the Red Desert, reducing 6 or 7 of the castles and watchtowers still under Dornish control to molten rubble. At the same time, he dropped tens of thousands of leaflets revealing the crimes of House Martell and House Will. In the middle of the 6th year of the conquest, Dornish raiders, assisted by a pirate king from the Stepstones, crossed the Sea of Dorne and plundered 6 or 7 towns and villages along the southern coast of Cape Wrath. They also set half of the Rainwood ablaze. Fire will be met with fire, declared Princess Meria, the Yellow Toad. Faced with such a provocation, the Targaryen dynasty could not stand idle. Later that same month, Queen Visenya flew to Dorne and commanded Vhagar to rain fire upon Lemonwood, Ghost Hill, and Tor. Dorne had the aid of a pirate king, but the Targaryen dynasty had the 7 warlords of the sea. The Ironborn pirate fleets of the Iron Islands rapidly expanded their influence after Aegon entrusted them with command of the Royal Navy. Coastal strongholds of Dorne were raided more than 10 times. Anything of value, including the population, was swept up by the Ironborn. The Martell regime was forced to retreat inland. After the 7 kings of the sea finished their plunder of Dorne, they turned the royal fleet toward the Stepstones and delivered a brutal blow to the pirates there. They were rivals, but also kindred spirits. While the Royal Navy had failed to uncover the pirates' hidden lairs, the 7 kings of the sea found them with ease. After eliminating the pirate queen, they seized a vast treasure hoard. It was clear, in the war of conquest in Dorne, the 7 kings of the sea from the Iron Islands reaped the greatest rewards. Though they held little territory, their plunder surpassed that of any other force. At the end of the 6th year of the conquest, the King's Road between Harrenhal and King's Landing was finally completed. Numerous official post stations were established along the route, linking the 2 regions in mutual economic development. Under Aegon's guidance, the Maesters successfully developed printing, and Aegon took the opportunity to grant several new noble titles. As noble families in Harrenhal grew in number, young knights began to look up to the newly built citadel of Harrenhal, proud to be accepted into it. Many noble children began studying the new doctrines of the Tower of the Eagle, but Aegon swiftly curbed the spread of these philosophies to ensure all new ideas and systems of thought remained under his control. Only those schools that aligned with royal interests were permitted to disseminate, and even those were still far from becoming Aegon's ideal official ideology. The battlefield had become a crucible even greater than Harrenhal itself. While the noble children bonded in the castle, the adults forged friendships in war. Aegon remained devoted to integrating the 7 kingdoms into a unified empire ruled by House Targaryen. He recruited noblemen from across the realm, and even a few women, to serve in the court and among his ministers. At Harrenhal, Aegon handpicked talented boys to serve as cupbearers, wine stewards, and pages, while girls became handmaidens and companions to the 2 queens. Through this, he strengthened ties between local nobility and the royal household, hoping his efforts would become royal tradition. He often held little Aenys in his arms during gatherings with vassals and their children. Though Aegon had some ideas for Aenys's future education, the boy was only 2 years old, still too young for formal training. For now, Aegon simply wanted him to grow accustomed to the atmosphere of courtly life. The young sons and daughters of noble families witnessed firsthand how King Aegon governed the realm. Gradually, they began to see themselves not merely as Westerlanders, Stormlanders, or Northerners, but as loyal servants of a unified kingdom. House Targaryen also arranged marriages between distant noble houses across the realm, fostering cooperation and mutual exchange among the newly conquered regions. However, Aegon's peace did not last long. Dorne's retaliation struck like a violent tide. House Martell had placed a bounty on the heads of any Targaryen lords who had invaded Dorne, offering sums equal to their ransom value. This despicable act led to a string of brutal murders. Lord Connington of Griffin's Roost was killed while hunting, Lord Murden of Mistwood and his entire family were poisoned with a barrel of Dornish red, and Lord Fell was smothered to death in a brothel in King's Landing. At Harrenhal, Aegon furiously denounced the Yellow Toad as a shameless villain. When he received a bounty list sent from the continent of Essos by his father Aerion, Aegon was furious. The list named every member of the Targaryen royal family as a target, including his eldest son, Aenys. Queen Visenya, upon seeing the bounty notice targeting the royal family, became alarmed and paranoid. She began wearing chainmail day and night, even beneath her court robes, and repeatedly urged the king to do the same. Aegon's refusal drove her into a rage. Even with Blackfire in your hand, you're still just one man, Visenya warned. And I can't always be by your side. Aegon calmly replied that he had many guards to protect him. Without a word, Visenya drew Dark Sister and, before the guards could react, slashed a quick line across her brother's face. Your guards are lazy and slow, she said. I could have killed you with ease. You need better protection. You have no honor. That was a sneak attack. Aegon shouted in outrage. Do you think an assassin would come at the king in broad daylight? Visenya shot back. With blood streaming down his face, Aegon had no choice but to agree. King Aegon had always been protected by valiant sworn knights, but Visenya believed that as ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, he should have 7 knights in his personal guard. Thus, the Kingsguard was born, a brotherhood of the 7 finest knights in the realm, dressed in pure white cloaks and armor, sworn to protect the king with their lives. Visenya modeled their oath after that of the Night's Watch. Like the black-cloaked crows on the wall, the White Sword Knights would serve for life. They were required to renounce all lands, titles, and property, dedicating themselves entirely to the king, obeying the strict rules of the order, and receiving only honor in return. Countless knights applied to join, prompting Aegon to consider holding a grand tournament to select the most worthy candidates. But Visenya refused outright. She insisted that the Kingsguard needed more than just martial prowess. No matter how skilled a man was in battle, if his loyalty was questionable, she would never place him near the king. She would choose the knights herself. The men selected by Queen Visenya for the Kingsguard were of varying ages and statures, drawn from all corners of the realm. Among them were younger sons of lords, heirs from ancient houses who had renounced their inheritance to serve the king, even a hedge knight and a bastard. What united them was their strength, speed, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. Skilled with spear and shield, they swore absolute devotion to the king. In the 7th year of the conquest, King Aegon Targaryen survived 3 assassination attempts, twice only thanks to the protection of the Kingsguard. One night in King's Landing, Queen Visenya herself was ambushed. Wielding Dark Sister, she slew the attackers personally, though 2 of her guards were killed in the process. When a faceless man appeared among the assassins, Aegon's fury reached its peak. Only then did he realize how merciful he had been toward the Martell regime and the traitorous lords of Dorne. He invited Visenya to ride with him on their dragons to Dorne, so they could finally unleash the wrath he had long suppressed. Rhaenys wanted to fly alongside them on Meraxes, but Aegon, haunted by the vision of her death in his apocalyptic dream, once again persuaded his sister not to go. Balerion and Vhagar launched raid after raid. Nearly every castle under Martell control in Dorne was burned 3 times. The breath of the Black Dread was so intense that the sand around Sunspear melted into glass. Dornish lords were forced into hiding, fleeing from one place to another, yet still unable to ensure their safety. Lord Fowler, Lord Vaith, Lady Toland, and 4 successive lords of Vaith Castle were all burned alive. Vaith Castle had become the Martell regime's final defensive stronghold against the Targaryen army, and thus the primary target of Aegon and Visenya's attacks. For the Martells, their plight did not end with dragonfire. On the continent of Essos, Aerion, Speaker of the Free City Council, issued a bounty targeting the Martell regime. The Targaryens and Martells were now locked in a brutal, unrelenting battle, one fought both in the open and in the shadows. Among the Targaryens, Aegon's campaign of vengeance against Dorne came to be known as the Dragon's Wrath. And due to the relentless devastation visited upon Dorne by Balerion and Vhagar, later historians would come to know this era as the year of the Dragonlord's wrath. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 5 comments 0 vote. Chapter 96. The Great Famine, People Eating People. The 7th year of the conquest marked the most rapid population growth in the Crownlands. From the Red Mountains to the Crownlands, carts carrying Dornishmen moved in a constant stream. Every day, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Dornish migrants were sent to designated settlement areas within the Crownlands. Under the supervision of trained slave overseers, they were quickly put to work in construction and production efforts throughout the region. But with the surge in foreign arrivals, Aegon was forced to confront a pressing issue, the skyrocketing cost of administration. After 2 years of continued migration, the Dornish population in the Crownlands had exceeded 300,000, making up 1/5 of the total population. Even if all the overseers from Volantis were relocated to Westeros, it still wouldn't be enough to manage them. With no other option, Aegon began recruiting local Westerosi and freed slaves to undergo training as slave overseers and serve as administrators. In times of acute labor shortage, Aegon would even promote outstanding slaves into management training. In doing so, former Valyrian slaves were reappointed as overseers, effectively returning to their old trade. The rise in immigration also brought escalating public security issues, which quickly became a headache for the lords of the Crownlands. Every day, the nobility had to deal with dozens of disputes and illegal cases involving migrants. Frustrated and overwhelmed, many Crownlands nobles lodged complaints with King Aegon, begging him to halt the migration. They claimed they had had enough of these unruly Dornishmen. Aegon had no choice but to reassure his direct vassals. He explained to his council the many benefits of a growing population and promised to dispatch maesters from the law school to each Crownland territory to help nobles handle immigration cases. With Aegon's deliberate patronage, the law school had become the most popular discipline among apprentices at the Tower of the Seven. The law school was founded on a guiding philosophical principle called judicialism. The core belief of judicialism held that a country should be governed by law, and its people by officials. The school advocated that power should be highly centralized in the hands of the monarch, who would govern the realm through a fully developed bureaucratic system to ensure the effective implementation of royal policy. Originally, the law school promoted the idea that everyone should be equal before the law, that nobles and commoners alike must be punished if they broke it. However, Aegon considered this view too radical and impractical. Under his influence, the doctrine was revised, giving rise to the current form of judicialism. Among the many intellectual schools fostered under Aegon's reign, judicialism was one of the few that met with his approval. Given the rapid population growth in the Crownlands, there was an urgent need for more administrators and local officials. Aegon began actively promoting legal studies and enrolling the children of knights and citizens into the program. Previously, the authority to adjudicate internal disputes had belonged exclusively to the lords, a sacred and inviolable symbol of noble power. But with vassals now overwhelmed by immigration cases, Aegon seized the opportunity to encroach on this vital domain. He sent maesters trained in law to the lands of his direct vassals to manage immigration issues. These maesters were given the title of judges, and they answered not to local lords but directly to the master of laws in the small council. Lady Argilla had served as master of laws for quite some time, but only now did she receive a new assignment. She had been busy drafting a unified legal code, but after becoming pregnant, her duties had paused, and she had remained at Harrenhal with Aegon. Aegon now tasked Lady Argilla with creating a judicial administrative system specifically for immigration. The system would be divided into 4 tiers: the Court of Knights, the Court of Lords, the Court of Dukes, and the Crown Court. To avoid triggering the lords' political sensitivities, Aegon made it clear that the Crown Court would deal only with immigration-related matters and that the new system would be piloted in the Crownlands alone. Thanks to Aegon's immense political prestige as the founding monarch, opposition within the realm was minimal. Since the reforms would apply only within the Crownlands and none of its vassals voiced objections, the rest of the kingdom had no grounds to protest. At the newly established citadel in Harrenhal, the law school became the first officially recognized and government-supported academic discipline of the Targaryen dynasty. Upon graduation, law-trained maesters were directly assigned government positions. As a result, many sons of knights, along with noble second sons and bastards, threw themselves into the study of law, hoping to pass the maester examinations and become judges. The crown lands, as envisioned by Aegon, were destined to be densely populated, a reality that rendered the traditional feudal system ineffective for governance. Most of Aegon's innovations at the new citadel in Harrenhal focused on light industry. Such industries required factories, which in turn depended on large numbers of skilled artisans. While the feudal manorial system was well suited for managing serfs, overseeing industrial workers demanded a far more flexible and comprehensive bureaucratic apparatus. Under Aegon's leadership, the crownlands flourished, and the War of Conquest entered its 8th year. The conquest of Dorne was still ongoing, though by now it required only a minimal garrison. In the year of the Dragonlord's wrath, Aegon's devastating assault on Dorne's environment severely crippled the strength of House Martell. With their power diminished, they could no longer mount a counterattack against Hellholt. Princess Yellowtoad could not even launch minor raids against the Targaryen forces anymore, as a massive famine had broken out in the western reaches of the Red Desert. Years of warfare had devastated Dorne's agriculture. Now, with blockades imposed by both the Seven Seas and the Free City Council, the Dornish faced a dire food shortage. Each day, starving Dornishmen journeyed east across the Red Desert toward Hellholt, begging for the Dragonlord's mercy. They yearned to join the Targaryen realm, hoping it would offer them a chance to survive the famine. From the refugees fleeing from western Dorne, Aegon learned that the towns beyond the Red Desert were strewn with corpses. In the wilds, some Dornishmen had even turned to cannibalism. The scenes described were horrific beyond imagination. Aegon ordered that all Dornish refugees be accepted and transported to the Crownlands. Upon arriving, the refugees were astonished to find the land lush and fertile. As long as they were willing to work hard, there was food to eat. Overcome with gratitude, they hailed Aegon as a saint reborn. Marshal Orys, stationed at Hellholt, requested permission to launch a full-scale assault on western Dorne, but Aegon refused. He claimed that the Red Desert's unfamiliar terrain posed too great a risk, and that he preferred to let famine punish the Dornish. He was in no hurry to attack. As a result, the garrison forces in Dorne began to withdraw, leaving behind only a portion of elite troops. In truth, Aegon had his own calculations. He estimated that the Kingdom of Dorne had a population of roughly 4 million. After 2 years of migration, only around 300,000 had been relocated, far from his goal of raising the Crownlands' population to 10 million. So the war in Dorne could not be allowed to end. Without the conflict, what justification would remain for continuing to relocate people to the Crownlands? Aegon's bottom line was to resettle at least 1 million Dornish before initiating a final, decisive campaign to annihilate Dorne. That was Aegon's true objective. Otherwise, given how frequently the Martell regime had provoked him, Aegon had no shortage of cruel methods he could have used to punish the Dornish, such as selling them salt laced with lead powder. He simply chose not to resort to such vicious tactics. Aegon then turned his focus away from Dorne and back to King's Landing, the city that had consumed so much of his effort and ambition. Thanks to the labor of the Dornish, construction in King's Landing had accelerated. The towers meant to house foreign envoys were beginning to take shape, and Aegon predicted that by the start of the 10th year of the conquest, the Targaryen court would be able to relocate there. Only then would King's Landing truly begin to function as the capital of the realm. But at the moment, the most critical construction site was not the Maidenbow, the Tower of Swords, or the dungeons reserved for advisors, it was the Seven-Star Cathedral, rising outside the outer walls of the Red Keep. Built to the standards of the grandest and most magnificent sept of the seven on the entire continent, the Seven-Star Cathedral was the cornerstone of Aegon's claim to the title of High Septon. Once completed, the cathedral would bring Aegon prestige and respect within the faith of the Seven. The aging High Septon, whose health was rapidly failing, would then pass the title on to him. With time running short, Aegon was determined to finish construction before the High Septon passed away. In the middle of the 8th year of the conquest, the royal family, as was customary, traveled to the summer palace in Highgarden for vacation. Aegon took the rare opportunity to visit Rhaedel and their son. His bastard, Garth, was already 2 years old. When Aegon saw the boy playing in the Garden of 1,000 Flowers, he was startled to find a flock of sparrows circling the child. Upon spotting his father, Garth gleefully commanded the sparrows to form 2 high Valyrian letters in the air, Father. Aegon stared, stunned, at the 100 or so sparrows hovering above the boy's head. How could he possibly control so many birds? Aren't skin changers only supposed to bond with one animal partner? Smiling, Aegon stepped forward and lifted the boy into his arms. He used his chip to scan Garth's attributes and discovered that his green-haired son had somehow awakened the skin changer gift, and was classified as Crank. Crank, Green Hand Bloodline, Gardener. Crank, Skin Changer, Beast Summoner. You can invade the consciousness of animals or other people and control their behavior. You may form contracts with animals whose spiritual traits are compatible with yours. The base number of animal companions is 100 plus a ratio based on your mental strength. Current number of contracted animal companions, 100. Garth was one of only 2 among his 4 sons who lacked true dragon blood. Yet, he was also the most gifted, possessing 2 crank talents. Perhaps divine blood and true dragon blood were inherently incompatible. His son Mont Durandon also lacked true dragon blood. Aegon gently set the boy down and asked softly, "When did you meet all these little friends?" Giggle, giggle. "I'm not telling you. You never come see me. Do you not like me?" Garth replied in a soft, sulky voice. Aegon smiled. "But I'm here now, aren't I?" In truth, Aegon was very fond of Garth. Otherwise, he wouldn't have allowed the child to call him father. In Westeros, bastards typically weren't permitted to use that word. Instead, they had to say, "my lord," or refer to a title. After playing with the boy for a while, Aegon instructed the maids to take good care of Garth and his sparrow companions. He then went off to spend time with Lady Rhaedel. At the same time, he began reconsidering the plans he had made for Garth. Now that the boy had displayed such promise, especially his rare and useful skin changer ability, Aegon intended to keep him close and personally guide his training. He would raise Garth alongside his brothers. One day, the boy would surely become a pillar of strength for the Targaryen dynasty. When the royal family departed Highgarden, Aegon set off with Garth and Rhaedel. Rather than return to Harrenhal with the royal fleet, he traveled straight across the Stormlands to Dragonstone. If anyone in House Targaryen could be called a true master of shapeshifting, it would be old Nurse Ilya. There was likely no second name that came close. Aegon had long hoped to bring her to teach at the new citadel, but for various reasons, the matter had been delayed again and again. Now that Garth had awakened his skin changer talent, Ilya was the ideal person to serve as his mentor. She had long cared for the Targaryen children on Dragonstone, and Aegon could sense how deeply she loved the little ones. Perhaps it was because she had been too young when she fled the Valyrian Peninsula, never having had children of her own, and carried that regret in her heart. After Balerion landed on the Dragonmont of Dragonstone, Aegon made his way to Ilya's cottage. But when he arrived, the steward informed him that the old nurse had set sail alone 2 months prior. She set sail alone? Aegon asked in disbelief, turning to the steward to confirm. Yes, Your Grace. She was just a humble nurse, so I didn't think it necessary to report it. I deeply apologize, I had no idea she held such importance in your eyes. The steward was visibly shaken and quickly fell to his knees, seeming to realize that Ilya was far more than she appeared. Aegon pushed open the cottage door and stepped inside. On the table, he saw a letter pinned beneath a key. Curious, he picked up the key and unfolded the letter. It was addressed to him. To Aegon, head of House Targaryen. The key enclosed is to the hidden chamber of the family vault. Inside lies the preserved body of one of our ancestors. Her soul still lingers in this world. Please keep it safe, and do not allow any harm to come to her. My time has come to an end. It is time for me to pursue the regret I have carried for over a century. Ilya Targaryen. Aegon had already guessed the identity of the ancestor in the vault. As he held the letter, his hand trembled slightly. He pocketed the key and the letter, then turned to the steward. Tell me everything about how the old nurse left. The steward bowed and spoke with care. At the time, she purchased a medium-sized boat without sails. She stocked it with food and fresh water but hired no crew, no sailors, no navigator, no first mate. She went alone. The ship, despite lacking wind or oars, began to move on its own. It sailed swiftly away from Dragonstone. Aegon turned to the window in the room, which faced east. He stepped forward and looked out toward the sea. Out there, lie the ruins of the Valyrian Peninsula. For a moment, a strange and stirring feeling rose in his chest. His first 2 wives, like Daenerys, had dreamed of building a new homeland in the west, in Westeros. But Ilya had chosen a small courtyard on Dragonstone, on the eastern side of the island, and had even positioned her window to face the Valyrian Peninsula. Perhaps on countless nights, she had stood by that window, gazing out at the distant ruins, longing to return home. Perhaps someone she loved still lingered there in her heart. Perhaps her most cherished memories lay buried in those ashes. Now, knowing that her time was near, she had finally resolved to return. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 4 comments 0 vote. Chapter 97, Quicksilver. Father, who is that old lady? Garth asked, his curiosity piqued as he noticed Aegon staring off into the distance. The sea breeze carried the faint taste of salt, lifting a few strands of silver hair from Aegon's forehead. Aegon smiled softly, lifted his son into his arms, and replied gently, she was an old acquaintance of mine. Perhaps she's gone in search of her homeland. Homeland? Garth echoed, puzzled. Still holding the boy with one arm, Aegon pointed toward the distant sea with the other. Far across those waters lies the birthplace of House Targaryen, the Valyrian Peninsula. It's the land where all dragons were born. Garth followed the direction of his father's finger, staring out over the narrow sea. Sunlight danced across the waves, sparkling like scattered gold. In his mind's eye, Garth saw a vast peninsula, and above it, thousands of dragons soared through the skies. Just then, a flock of sparrows fluttered past the window, chirping and fluttering. They arranged themselves into the shape of an island, with a few acting out the roles of dragons, circling the mountains. Aegon laughed, clearly amused by the boy's imagination. Garth wasn't even 3 yet, but he was already far more perceptive than Aenys had been at that age. If Garth had true dragon blood, Aegon wouldn't hesitate to restore the Targaryen name to him. But, unfortunately, he had only inherited his mother's lineage. Aegon chose to remain on Dragonstone rather than return to Harrenhal. Since his arrival in Westeros, he hadn't stayed long on the island. Now, with Garth at his side, he took time to explore the island's structures and share stories from his own childhood, savoring these rare, peaceful moments with his son. In the evenings, he spent time with Rhaedel, seeking comfort in her company. Although the king had not returned to Harrenhal, the royal court continued to operate smoothly. Queen Visenya's authority in court had grown considerably over the years. More and more, she made decisions on her own, without needing to consult Aegon. When members of the small council raised the issue with the king, Aegon expressed no dissatisfaction. He simply instructed his ministers to maintain a harmonious relationship with the queen. For many years, Visenya had been unable to conceive, and Aegon, feeling a quiet sense of guilt toward his elder sister, was inclined to indulge her preferences. This, however, made Rhaenys increasingly resentful. Aegon's decision not to return to Harrenhal this time had left her furious. Rhaenys mounted Merryxes and flew to Dragonstone with their son, Aenys. Aegon had no choice but to meet her in person. Aenys, now 4 years old, slid gracefully down from Merryxes' wing. His bold entrance made Garth look on with envy. I told you, I was only staying a few weeks. Why come all this way? Aegon said, stepping forward to embrace Rhaenys and planting a light kiss on her cheek. I didn't come for you, Rhaenys replied, turning her head to avoid his gesture. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not upset about you being here alone with Rhaedel. Aegon sighed inwardly. As if I'd believe that. Rhaedel brought Garth forward and bowed respectfully. Your Grace. Your Highness. Rhaenys gave the mother and son a faint nod, then turned to Aegon with a frown. I came to help Aenys choose a dragon. He's already 4 and still hasn't bonded with one. When Aenys was still an infant, Aegon had placed a black dragon egg in his cradle, but no hatchling had emerged. Hearing that his older brother was going to tame a dragon, Garth's eyes immediately lit up. He had always envied his father's Balerion. But Aegon had told him he lacked dragon blood. The one time Garth had climbed onto Balerion's back, the great beast let out a deep, disapproving growl. The force of that dragon's presence alone had turned the boy's face ghostly pale. Aegon rubbed his forehead with a sigh, clearly annoyed with himself. Look at me, forgetting something so important. He turned to Aenys. Come, I'll take you to the dragon keepers myself. We'll find you a dragon, something large and strong. Awesome. Father, I want one as big as Balerion. Aenys's cheeks flushed with excitement as he clapped his hands. The group made their way along the path to Dragonmont. The sea wind howled around them, whipping their cloaks and sleeves. Rhaedel appeared nervous. She had always been somewhat afraid of the two queens. Most of her time had been spent in Highgarden, and she had rarely interacted with the royal family at Harrenhal. Now, surrounded by royalty, she seemed unsure of where to place her hands and feet. Rhaenys, on the other hand, appeared completely at ease. She approached Rhaedel on her own accord, smiling gently. From time to time, she would point to Aenys and Garth playing with the sparrows, laughing at their antics. Rhaedel, sharp and observant, quickly picked up on Rhaenys' intent. She understood instantly. Garth's skinchanger talent was no small thing. It was a rare and valuable gift, enough for the royal family to extend such gestures of intimacy and goodwill. Prince Aenys also seemed eager to befriend Garth. He made no effort to act superior, nor did he show the slightest disdain for Garth's status as a bastard. Smiling brightly, Aenys took Garth's little hand and began sharing amusing stories and observations. Aegon watched the two boys play and laugh together, his heart full of warmth and pride. It delighted him to see his sons, his blood, getting along so well. Just as his own father, Aerion, had once sent the bastard Orys Baratheon to his side to foster a bond, Aegon now hoped that Aenys and Garth would grow up together as childhood friends, and one day, become a loyal king and his steadfast advisor. Although Garth's animal companions weren't ferocious beasts like tigers or leopards, the humble sparrow proved far more valuable in the realm of intelligence. With 100 sparrows, he could monitor an entire castle without a single blind spot, an extraordinary skill in both military and political affairs. That was precisely why Aegon held Garth in such high regard, and why Rhaenys made sure her son spent time with him. They soon entered Dragonmont. The dragonkeepers hurried forward and respectfully presented a map of the dragon nests for Aenys to make his selection. Aenys resolutely chose the largest wild adult dragon on Dragonmont, second only in size to Merryx's. But he failed to tame it. Its scales gleamed like green metal, and every time Aenys approached, it bared its massive jaws and let out a thunderous roar that nearly knocked him to the ground. Left with no other choice, Aenys moved on to try another dragon. He made several more attempts with other adult dragons, but each time ended in failure. That day's attempt at dragon taming had to be called off in disappointment. Garth, watching from the side, couldn't help feeling eager to try himself, but Aegon stopped him just in time. Divine blood ran through Garth's veins, and dragons seemed to instinctively reject it. The only reason Garth had ever ridden Balerion was because Aegon had commanded it. Though Balerion had been clearly unwilling, he submitted to the king's will and tolerated Garth's presence. As night fell, Aenys looked dejected and disheartened. Aegon could see how his eldest son had been shaken by the failed attempts. The boy's temperament was indeed on the softer side, he struggled to bounce back quickly after a setback. At that moment, the captain of the dragonkeepers leaned in and whispered, "Your Grace, there are still 2 dragon eggs in storage that the prince hasn't tried yet. Shall we bring them out?" The reminder jolted Aegon. He instantly recalled which eggs the captain meant. They were the 2 silver dragon eggs seized from House Valentine during the War of Volantis. "Bring them here," Aegon instructed. The captain hurried off. Soon, 2 dragon eggs the size of a human head, gleaming as though cast from pure silver, were carefully placed before Aenys. "They're beautiful." Aenys's eyes widened in awe. Under the flickering candlelight, the smooth, scaled shells shimmered with a soft glow, as if some hidden magic pulsed within them. Aenys immediately reached out, gently cradled one of the eggs, and held it to his chest. Then he lowered his head and stared intently at it, eyes filled with hope. "How does it feel? Do you sense anything?" Rhaenys asked anxiously. Aenys gave a small nod, his face glowing with joy. "I can feel a tiny life inside, it's calling out to me. It wants to come out. It's so close." Then came a crisp crack. A fine fracture appeared on the eggshell's surface, spreading outward like a spider's web. More soft crackles followed as pieces of the shell began to fall away. A small silver hatchling slowly poked out its head, its bright eyes blinking as it curiously took in the world around it, letting out a soft, babyish chirp. It wriggled, squirming its way out of the broken shell. Its wet silver scales shimmered enchantingly under the candlelight. Its tiny wings flapped weakly as it tried to find balance. At last, the little dragon stood, wobbly but free, nestled in Aenys's palm, nuzzling his fingers affectionately. Aegon gazed at the silver hatchling, and the memory of House Valentine's full-ground silver dragon, killed under the barrage of siege crossbows, flashed through his mind. He silently prayed, "Please don't grow up to be brittle. If a Targaryen dragon can be easily shot down, our family's glory could become a laughingstock." Ha ha ha. Aenys flushed with excitement, raising the hatchling high into the air for everyone to see. I have a dragon. I have a dragon. He gently placed the silver hatchling on the table and stroked its back with great care. The young dragon affectionately licked his small hand with its tongue, its manner irresistibly endearing. Give your little dragon a name, Aegon said with a smile. Aenys stared at the smooth, shining scales and announced proudly, it shines bright and lights up the darkness. I'll name it Quicksilver. To celebrate his son's success, Aegon held a small feast on Dragonstone. Prince Aenys made his public debut at the banquet, proudly cradling his new dragon Quicksilver. The sight drew a round of loud cheers and applause from all in attendance. Far away in Harrenhal, Queen Visenya received word that Aenys had successfully hatched a silver dragon. She sat silently, holding the letter in her hands, lost in thought. Tears slipped down her cheeks, soaking her pale face. Visenya couldn't understand why she had yet to conceive a child. She had taken the initiative to be intimate with Aegon, yet her womb remained still and silent. Alone in her chamber, she curled up tightly around her pillow, sobbing softly in the dark. Eventually, the exhaustion of her sorrow pulled her into sleep. In her dreams, Visenya found herself adrift in a pitch-black void, her own body floating silently in the empty space. Suddenly, the darkness lit up, countless stars blinked into existence, glowing with strange and ethereal light. The stars twisted and warped, transforming into dazzling beams of energy that danced like spirits toward her, then streamed directly into her eyes. Visenya jolted awake, gasping for breath. She opened her eyes and looked around. The night was deep. Rising slowly, she walked to the window and looked out over the Dragonlord Tower. Tonight, the sky was clear and cloudless. Stars glittered like precious gems embedded in velvet. She recalled the strange vision in her dream and felt a deep, inexplicable connection between it and the night sky above. Aegon had once mentioned that the gods resided among the stars. Could that vision, so vivid, so strange, have been a revelation from one of them? Visenya hesitated for a moment, then made her choice. She activated a Valyrian resonance technique and locked her gaze on the stars. In an instant, her pupils split apart. Dozens of tiny irises swirled into place, clustering within her eyes. The frequency of her mental resonance spiked rapidly, then hit its peak. From the starry sky, waves of psychic energy surged down like a roaring tide, slamming into her mind. The pressure was so intense it felt as if her head might burst. Through the pain, Visenya clung to her purpose. She prayed fervently to the gods in the heavens above. Please, tell me how I can bear Aegon's child. I long for a child of his blood. Then, one star in the sky, a brilliant violet one, suddenly flared. The many pupils in her eyes trembled violently, spinning like a chaotic kaleidoscope. After a long, agonizing moment, the motion slowed, the extra pupils faded, and her eyes returned to normal. Visenya didn't waste a second. She grabbed parchment and ink, and began recording the arcane knowledge the gods had just imparted to her. Grind 10 grams of wild elephant testicle and intestines into powder, mix with 10 milliliters of dragon blood and 5 grams of dragonglass. Supporting ingredients: 10 milliliters of pure water, 3 drops of nightstar herb extract, 7 mint leaves, 3 drops of poison hemlock juice, 9 grams of dragonblood grass powder. Dozens of ingredients, each more obscure than the last, all written down in precise detail, along with 10 complex preparation steps. The potion, once completed, would only take effect if consumed during a mysterious, ritual. Visenya fought through the splitting pain in her head, forcing herself to finish transcribing the full formula. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 8 comments 0 vote. Chapter 98. But is it all worth it? In the late 8th year of the conquest, the invention of paper and the rise of printing in the new citadel swept through like a spring breeze, further enriching its academic climate and accelerating the spread of the only officially recognized discipline, law. Several legal texts co-authored by the law school and King Aegon became bestsellers within the citadel. Works like The Rule of Law Under the Great Upheaval, The Power of Heresy, and Justice in the Round were especially popular among apprentices. As the founding monarch, Aegon's overwhelming authority had, in some ways, reshaped the academic aspirations of both noble heirs and aspiring maesters. At the same time, the new citadel's second officially sanctioned discipline, mathematics, was steadily coming into its own. Mathematics, the foundation of all things, was vital to nearly every aspect of the Dornish conquest, from population tallies and immigration logistics, to the number of soldiers, supplies, rations, warhorses, weapons, and daily frontline consumption of resources. The management of the Dragonlord's treasury and the Empire's fiscal budget also depended heavily on mathematics. Aegon introduced the concept of Arabic numerals, taught the multiplication table, the four basic operations, and how to create statistical charts. These innovations simplified complex calculations, lightened workloads, and increased accuracy. He understood clearly that everything, administration, warfare, policy, was ultimately bound to numbers. Though the level of mathematics in the world of ice and fire was not low, it remained in the hands of the elite. Foundational education was lacking, and there were no accessible entry-level materials. To remedy this, Aegon introduced simplified formulas and mnemonic devices that significantly lowered the barrier to learning mathematics. Over several years, the old methods of calculation gradually merged with Aegon's new system. By this year, a new mathematical discipline had finally taken shape, mature enough to begin admitting students from the general population. Aegon then established an accounting administration under the oversight of the Master of Coin. Every math-trained maester was eligible to take the official Targaryen accounting exam. Those who passed received a certificate and could serve in the Empire's accounting department. The department was tasked with compiling national tax data, drafting region-specific tax policies based on economic conditions and classifications, and managing disbursements and financial records for the Dragonlord's treasury. Though the mathematics faculty remained short-staffed, Aegon already had plans for a future Bureau of Statistics. At present, the Crown lands still lacked precise population data. Most figures were speculative, drawn from indirect sources. This greatly displeased Aegon. He viewed mathematics as one of the cornerstones of the future Targaryen Empire. For low-ranking officials, it was the most essential skill of all. To promote the discipline, Aegon personally appeared at the Citadel and awarded honorary medals to several senior scholars in mathematics, encouraging apprentices to take the subject seriously. With Citadel affairs in order, Aegon turned his gaze eastward, toward the scorched deserts of Dorne. In the latter half of the 8th conquest year, the Targaryen dynasty pressed its offensive against the kingdom of Dorne, steadily wearing down its remaining forces. By now, Dorne resembled a land laid to waste, ravaged by famine, plague, and drought. It had become a living hell. Slave hunters from Volantis had taken to calling it the cursed land, yet House Martell still clung defiantly to their family motto, unbowed, unbent, unbroken. A captured Dornish knight swore before Aegon that Marya Martell would rather see all her people dead than allow them to become slaves of House Targaryen. Aegon's response was ice-cold. He'd be happy to help her fulfill that wish. To him, the Dornish were maddeningly stubborn. Even with the war all but won, they still shouted their defiance. Their proud, unyielding spirit struck Aegon as both laughable and pitiful. Within the Crown lands, the growing Dornish population had become a frequent source of unrest. Most crimes reported by the vassals seemed to involve Dornishmen. Aegon had a clear vision for the Crown lands. He wanted the Valyrian descendants to become the dominant ethnic group. Anything else would jeopardize the stability of the Targaryen regime. To that end, he regularly wrote to Aegon, urging the Free City Council to send more slaves. The Targaryen dynasty also issued generous resettlement offers to Valyrians on the continent of Essos, inviting them to return to Westeros and serve once again under the Dragonlord's banner. Meanwhile, assassination attempts against the royal family had not ceased. Aegon and his father, Aegon, jointly pressured the House of Black and White in Braavos. They issued a stark warning. If the faceless men made another attempt on the Targaryen bloodline, the dynasty would unleash its full wrath, the dragon's fury, upon the free city. Though Braavos was the strongest of the free cities, even it did not dare challenge the Targaryens head-on. From that point forward, the faceless men withdrew from any involvement in plots against the Targaryen royal house. The Dorne campaign was marked by bloodshed, but the most infamous atrocity came in the opening months of the 9th year. Will of Will, infamously known as the Widow Lover, forced his way into the wedding of Sir John Cavell, heir to the fief of Little Stag, and Lady Arya Oakhart, daughter of the Lord of Old Oak. Will had bribed a lowly servant to sneak in through a side entrance. He and his men butchered Lord Oakhart and most of the wedding guests. Then, in front of the bride, he castrated the groom. Lady Arya and her maids were gang-raped, abducted, and later sold to slavers in Mur. The atrocity enraged Aegon. No longer willing to tolerate delays, he ordered Orys to launch the final conquest of Dorne. Even Aegon's youngest son, Garth, just over 3 years old, took part in the campaign. His sparrows became a vital tool for reconnaissance, helping the Targaryen army avoid hidden dangers in the Red Desert. Orys led the forces across the burning sands without issue, the army sweeping toward Vaith like an unrelenting tide. Outside the walls of Vaith, countless Dornish refugees lay dead. Starved and too weak to cross the desert to Hellholt and surrender, they had no choice but to wait for death at the city's gates. With tens of thousands of Targaryen soldiers at their gates, the nobles of Vaith Castle had already fled in a panic, leaving behind only a mass of desperate refugees. The refugees fell to their knees, pleading with Orys for food to ease their hunger. Orys had little Garth seated before him on horseback. Garth's eyes were wide as he stared at the corpses lining the roadside. The sight of the starving and dead pierced his young heart, and sorrow welled up inside him. He couldn't help but sigh for the fallen Dornish. Sensing the boy's emotional turmoil, Orys spoke steadily from atop his horse. There's no meaning in mourning the dead. If death has any meaning, it's in how it can be used. Having endured the torment of captivity at the hands of the widow lover, Orys's words had become increasingly severe, and that harshness only struck Garth more deeply. The boy turned his head and asked, "Then, what is the meaning of life?" "There is none. If there is, it's to serve his grace with loyalty," Orys replied calmly. Garth fell silent, deep in thought. Just then, a refugee stumbled into the path of Orys's horse. Orys frowned and reached for the steel sword at his waist with his maimed left arm. Seeing this, Garth quickly shook his head and placed one hand on Orys's to stop him from drawing. With the other, he pulled a small piece of bread from his cloak. A sparrow swooped down from the sky, took the bread in its beak, and flew toward the refugee. The moment the man saw the sparrow bringing bread, his face lit up with joy. But just as the bird released the bread, the refugee lunged, not for the food, but for the sparrow itself. He grabbed the small bird out of the air, clutched it to his chest, and tore into it, swallowing feathers and bones along with flesh. Clearly, the man wasn't stupid. He knew the sparrow held more nutrition than the morsel of bread. Garth cried out in pain and clutched his head. The death of his animal companion caused a strain on his mental energy. A moment later, his tear-filled eyes turned red. He raised his head and stared at the refugee. Orys stopped a nearby soldier who moved to arrest the man. He looked down and said quietly to Garth, "Now do you understand the meaning of life?" Sniffling, Garth nodded heavily, tears brimming in his eyes. "Thank you, uncle. I understand." Still, the refugee stared greedily at Garth, feathers stuck to his lips. "My lord, is there more?" "I want more." Garth raised a finger and said coldly, "As you wish." In an instant, over 100 sparrows overhead responded to his command. Like a swarm of wasps, they dove down toward the refugee. They weren't mere birds, they were small raptors, sharpened by Garth's mental training. The one that had been caught earlier had only been taken because Garth had been careless. Now they descended with precision, their beaks gouging out eyes, their talons ripping open throats, bellies, and more. As the cries of the dying refugee echoed, the head of House Bolton rode up, smirking at the bloody chaos. "Dornish scum. If they'd known this would happen, maybe they wouldn't have turned on us," he sneered. "They took the Targaryens' kindness for granted. Betrayed us. Stabbed us in the back. Well, this is the price." He flicked his blood-red cloak behind him and continued on toward Vaith Castle. In a cavern beneath Sunspear, Princess Maria, the yellow toad, had grown frail with age. Her health had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer care for herself. She sat in a chair, listening as her son, Nymor, read out military and political reports from the Martell regime. When she heard that Orys, the Targaryen dynasty's field marshal, had led his army deep into West Dorne, crossed the Greenblood River, and was now just a few miles from Sunspear, her eyes filled with tears of bitter regret. Nymor saw his mother begin to tremble. Her hands twisted like clawed branches, spasming uncontrollably. Panicked, he cried, "Mother! What's wrong? I'll call the..." But Maria reached out and grabbed his sleeve, shaking her head to stop him from calling the Black Maester. Her dim gaze fixed on her son, and she rasped, "We held to our house words. We resisted the Dragonlord for 4 years. We did what the other 6 kingdoms could not. But was it worth it?" Nymor stood frozen, unable to speak. He wanted to say no. That it hadn't been worth it. But he feared that if she heard the truth, the shock might kill her. House Martell had learned from the downfall of the others. They refused to meet the Dragonlord in castles, open plains, rainstorms, or at sea. They avoided duels and frontal assaults, relying solely on ambushes and guerrilla warfare. But even that had failed in the face of Aegon's strategy of encirclement. Their young men were constantly relocated. Crops could not grow in the face of famine and fear. The economy collapsed. And in West Dorne, the Martells had lost the people's loyalty. Now, with the Targaryens at Sunspear's doorstep, the fall of House Martell seemed inevitable. After a long silence, Nymor said softly, "Mother, we should surrender. Aegon is a just ruler. He won't destroy House Martell. We've ruled Dorne for thousands of years. He'll consider the people's hearts." Marya sighed. "There's nothing else to do. Offer him my head. It should appease him. That boy Aegon, he's earned his pride, driving us this far." That night, before the last few loyal vassals of House Martell, Marya the Yellow Toad passed the title of Prince of Dorne to her son and placed the crown upon his head. Then she revealed their plan to surrender. "No, princess, never." One lord cried out. "The Dornish never yield. I'll cut off Orys's other hand, his limbs too. To hell with House Targaryen," roared the widow lover, face twisted in rage. Marya rose unsteadily, laughter ringing through the cavern as she looked around at her gathered lords. "Good. That's the Dornish spirit. That's our blood. The Targaryens may bring us to our knees once, but we will rise and fight again, and again, and again." With those final words, she seized the curved blade at Nymar's waist and slit her own throat. Nymor trembled violently as he knelt and severed her head. Then, raising it high above him, he let out a hoarse, soul-rending roar. "Unbowed! Unbowed!" echoed the vassals, each dropping to one knee, right fists thudding against their chests as they faced their new prince. "Dorne is unbowed. Dorne will never." That night was soaked in grief, a night that would surely be remembered in the annals of Dorne and sung by countless bards. But the most tragic moment was yet to come. It would arrive with the dawn. The next day, Prince Nymor of Dorne led the Martell nobles and several thousand soldiers to kneel in submission before the Targaryen army, 10 miles outside Sunspear. When Orys saw the line of Dornish nobles kneeling in perfect order, he allowed a faint smile to curl at the corner of his lips, then burst into wild laughter. Prince Nymor, his hands trembling, held a wooden box. He opened it to reveal the severed head of Marya, the Yellow Toad, and cried out in anguish toward Orys, "The kingdom of Dorne surrenders to the Targaryen dynasty. House Martell willingly accepts demotion to the rank of duke." Orys silenced his laughter, his face turning expressionless as he rode forward to face Nymor, locking eyes with him. "Marshal Orys," Nymor said, forcing a strained, sycophantic smile. "The royal House Martell of Dorne submits willingly." Orys said nothing. He merely removed the glove from his right hand, exposing the stump left by the widow lover's blade. Then, smiling softly, he gave a slow shake of his head. Nymar's smile froze. A dreadful sense of foreboding surged through him. Without a word, Orys drew his longsword with his left hand and raised it high. He pointed the blade directly at the kneeling Dornish lords and shouted to the Targaryen army, "The Prince of Dorne refuses to surrender. He resists to the end. Targaryen forces, charge. Full assault." Even as his voice echoed, the blade came crashing down toward Nymar's neck. In an instant, the entire scene turned. The Dornish had believed surrender would spare their lives, but Orys answered their submission with ruthless execution. On the battlefield, the Targaryen army surged forward like a tidal wave, descending upon the stunned Dornish ranks. War cries rang out. Steel clashed. Smoke and blood filled the air. The Dornish soldiers, caught off guard and terrified, tried to mount a defense, but without preparation, they stood no chance against the ferocity of the Targaryen assault. Prince Nymar's eyes widened in horror and disbelief. He never imagined that Orys would be so merciless, offering no clemency, not even a sliver of hope. As the cold steel neared his throat, he stared helplessly, overwhelmed by the crashing tide of death. With a sharp crack, his head, etched with shock and despair, was severed cleanly and fell, a spray of blood misting the air. His body followed, slumping to the ground. Around him, the Dornish lords screamed in desperation, scrambling in vain to resist. But it was already far too late. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon comp BlurryDream. 8 comments 0 vote. Chapter 99, The Heir Prince. It was a bloody massacre of the Martell nobility. Both the reigning Prince of Dorne, Nymor, and the notorious widow lover Will perished in this horrific slaughter. How could the Martell regime have been so naive as to imagine that Aegon or Orys would show them mercy? In truth, the kingdom of Dorne had long reached its breaking point. Under the relentless pressure of the Targaryen dynasty's various tactics, both its population and the will of its people had been steadily eroded and dismantled. Had the Targaryens continued their strategies in Sunspear, enclosures, forced relocations, public smear campaigns, the Martell regime would have inevitably been wiped from existence. Surrender had been nothing more than a desperate, final attempt at resistance. Orys unleashed his long-suppressed fury outside the gates of Sunspear. He mutilated Will, the widow lover who had taken his right hand, turning him into a human stake and impaling him from behind with a spear, displaying the body at the city gate. Only the gods knew what tortures Orys had endured during his captivity to make a man so hardened become this extreme. His brutal methods loomed over Sunspear like a heavy, oppressive storm cloud. Behind the head of House Bolton trailed a cloak made of flayed human skin, now over 10 feet long, dragging behind him like a blood-red carpet. Faces, bloody and grotesque, would occasionally surface on the hide before vanishing again. Orys watched uneasily as the Bolton chief skinned people alive on the battlefield. While he found grim satisfaction in seeing traitors punished, the twisted abilities of House Bolton still sent chills down his spine. He noticed a disturbing pattern. The cloak seemed to grow only when the skins of nobles were added to it. This campaign would later be named the Battle of the Broken Spears by the scholars who accompanied the army. Following the victory, the Targaryen forces occupied Sunspear. Orys personally took command of the royal stronghold of Dorne. As the army marched into the city, little Garth's sparrows scattered into every corner. Should any remnants of the Martell regime attempt an ambush, Garth would sense it instantly and alert Orys. Orys came to realize the true terror of Garth's abilities. If he assigned one of the 100 sparrows to each of 100 commanders, Garth could act as an information hub, transmitting messages via the birds and coordinating the forces with astonishing efficiency. During the citywide purge of Martell loyalists, this ability proved instrumental. The severed heads of Princess Yellowtoad Maria and her son Nymor were treated with lime and sent to King's Landing under guard. Along with them, Orys submitted a letter seeking Aegon's instructions for the administration of Dorne. Though the heads had yet to arrive, Aegon understood the outcome from Orys' report. He ordered Orys to marry Daria, Nymer's eldest daughter and heir, as a means to establish House Baratheon's claim over Dorne. Daria was the only member of the Martell elite to be granted a pardon. She was a plump woman, not unlike her grandmother Maria in size. For the sake of the realm's stability, Marshal Orys would have to bear this political arrangement. In the same letter, Aegon introduced a chilling new term: exterminate 9 generations. King Aegon had always enjoyed coining new words and creating novel ideas, something the ministers of the Targaryen dynasty had grown used to. But this new term, crafted specifically for Dorne, filled every Targaryen official with dread. The extermination of 9 clans would encompass 4 branches from the father's side, including married aunts and their children. 3 branches from the mother's side, including the entire families of both maternal grandparents. 2 branches from the wife's side, including both the father-in-law's and mother-in-law's households. For ministers hailing from ancient noble houses thousands of years old, this punishment was nothing short of annihilation. It shook their understanding of justice to its core. Some attempted to dissuade Aegon, urging him to show restraint, but he refused them outright. Aegon addressed the court sternly: "Those who surrender to me and then rebel, I will make sure their entire bloodlines are erased. That was the oath I swore upon my ascension. Or do you now expect me to break that vow?" His defiance left the dissenting ministers speechless. Upon receiving the royal edict, Orys carried out Aegon's orders to the letter. The harbor of Sunspear was transformed into an execution ground. Thousands of family members belonging to Dorne's rebel lords were dragged there for judgment. After the first wave of executions, thousands beheaded by Orys himself, hundreds more followed daily. The ancient harbor ran red with blood. Swarms of sharks fed on the discarded corpses. It was a vision of hell brought to life. For this merciless campaign, the Dornish gave Orys a grim new title: the Butcher with the Bloodied Hand. To ensure that the price of rebellion would never be forgotten, Orys renamed the blood-soaked harbor, Blood Harbor. The severed heads of the rebel lords were stacked high into towers of skulls, some over 10 meters tall. Like grotesque cult totems, they loomed over the shore, their rotting eye sockets forever staring at the crimson-stained land, bearing witness to the cruel fate that had befallen them. It is said that ever since that day, a cold mist shrouds Blood Harbor each night. And in the wind, one can hear low, sorrowful wails, the restless spirits of the slain rebels, doomed to wander, unwilling to fade. By the end of the 9th year of the conquest, several key structures of the Red Keep in King's Landing had been completed. The outland lords now had towers to reside in, signaling that the royal court could officially move its administrative center into the capital. The kingdom of Dorne had been successfully conquered. After Orys's harsh suppression and military occupation, Sunspear had finally returned to a measure of stability. Even beyond these two triumphs, Aegon was most delighted by the news that Visenya was finally with child. He hosted a grand feast at Harrenhal to celebrate with his ministers, and during the banquet, he announced plans to hold a great tournament when the royal court relocated to King's Landing in the 10th year of the conquest. The tournament would serve three purposes. First, to celebrate the Targaryen dynasty's final unification of the continent of Westeros. Second, to rejoice in Queen Visenya's pregnancy. Third, to honor those who had distinguished themselves during the conquest of Dorne. The court praised the king's decision wholeheartedly. Such a monumental conquest indeed warranted an equally grand celebration. At the turn of the 10th year, all the Targaryen nobles gathered in King's Landing. For many, it was their first glimpse of the Red Keep's towering, magnificent walls. 7 massive gates had been built as the Red Keep's main entrances, each protected by iron portcullises, reinforced doors, and well-armed guards. The lords and vassals marveled at Aegon's devotion to the faith of the Seven, noting how even the inner walls had 7 gates. Their attention then shifted to the colossal Sept of 7 stars, still under construction in the outer city. Seeing this, they had no further doubts about the king's piety. In the dining hall of Visenya's tower, the Targaryen royal family and their lovers sat gathered around a long table. Aegon made little distinction between bastards and trueborn children. His bastards, after all, were destined for high status, and so they were permitted to dine at the same table. Candlelight flickered in the spacious hall. At the head of the table sat Aegon, casting his gaze over his wives, lovers, and the children of House Targaryen. He smiled faintly and raised his golden goblet. The 2 queens and 3 lovers followed suit, lifting their cups. The princes and 3 children, guided by their mothers, also raised their goblets and looked toward their father. My loves, and my children. I'm grateful that we are all gathered here as one family. The kingdom is like the rising sun, it needs the united effort of the royal bloodline to thrive and flourish. For House Targaryen, a toast. Aegon raised his gleaming goblet and took a sip. For House Targaryen. For the realm. In their words, one could faintly hear the distinction within Aegon's bloodline. Garth and Mond, lacking the royal surname, both said, for the realm, before, for House Targaryen. Aegon noticed the difference. He lowered his cup, his gaze falling one by one on his 3 bastards. You 3 may one day found your own houses outside the royal line, or inherit existing ones. You may rule lands and lead your own people, he said, pointing to Garth, Mond, and Megan in turn. But even then, I expect you to always consider yourselves part of House Targaryen. The blood of the Dragonlord runs in your veins. You are and will always be children of House Targaryen. And if the day ever comes that House Targaryen falls, tell me, what will you do? Rhaenys reached out, gently squeezing her husband's hand, then chuckled as she addressed the children. Aegon, you're scaring them. Aegon turned his hand and pressed hers flat to the table, shaking his head. Then he looked back at the children, his expression solemn. I'm not speaking in empty threats. Our House Targaryen hails from the Valyrian Peninsula. In its prime, the Valyrian Freehold had over 1,000 dragons. And now, the peninsula is nothing but a scorched ruin. No house is immune to destruction. Don't turn your backs on that brutal truth. If one day House Targaryen faces extinction, here's what you must do. Choose a male heir from your own bloodline to carry on the great name of Targaryen. That is the duty that comes with the dragon blood flowing in your veins. Father, I understand. I will remember your words, little Garth said, rising first to show his resolve to Aegon. Then he lifted his cup and drained it in one gulp. Me too. Mond, a chubby little boy, followed his brother's example and downed his own cup of wine. Megan, with a more delicate appearance, rose and gave a formal nod to Aegon before sitting down again. As a Targaryen by name, Megan was heir to a cadet branch destined to inherit leadership of the Free City Council. Rhaenys withdrew her hand from Aegon's and gave his forearm a light slap, scolding playfully, look at you, why get so serious? It's not every day we're all gathered around the table as a family. Then she turned to her son and said, Aenys, as the eldest, you should take good care of your younger brothers. Come now, help Garth, Megan, and Mond each get a slice of venison. Yes, mother, Aenys said with a cheerful smile. At the far end of the table, the children laughed and joked as they ate, while Aegon, the two queens, and his lovers dined in leisure at the front, occasionally glancing over and remarking on who was eating the most, who was the fastest, or who was being the most mischievous. Visenya gently stroked her slightly rounded belly, her gaze resting on Prince Aenys, whose demeanor already carried the makings of a leader. A flicker of jealousy crossed her heart as she quietly pondered. At the table, Rhaenys was warmly chatting with Aegon's three lovers, with whom she was quite close. Rhaenys's open nature meant they often served Aegon together with her, so their relationship was far more intimate than with Queen Visenya, who was usually cold and preoccupied with state affairs. As the dinner neared its end, Shera suddenly spoke up. Your Grace, look at how well Prince Aenys gets along with his brothers. He truly carries himself like an elder sibling. Indeed. And I've heard Prince Aenys is also a wonderful singer, Rhaedel added with a smile, clapping her hands. She then called down the table, Little Aenys, would you sing a song for us to close the evening? Hearing that it was his mother's close friend, and Garth's mother, who made the request, Aenys didn't hesitate. He cleared his throat and began to sing. The father's face is strong and stern, he judges wrongs and guards the just, he weighs the fates of every soul, and smiles upon the young and small. The mother brings the gift of life, and watches o'er each woman's path. At first, Aegon smiled. But as the lyrics continued, his expression darkened. He set down his knife and fork in silence, picked up a pair of chopsticks, and slowly nibbled on a side dish, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on Aenys's performance. When the song ended, the hall broke into cheers and applause. Everyone clapped, save for two people, Aegon, and Visenya. Where did you learn that hymn to the seven? Aegon asked flatly. Father, it was taught to me by Septon Rolder, Aenys replied, puffing out his chest with pride. Aegon lowered his eyes and fell silent for a moment. As High Septon himself, he had appointed every Septon in the Crownlands, and there was no one by the name of Rolder. Why that look? Aenys heard you were a devout follower and learned the song just for tonight, Rhaenys chimed in, displeased by Aegon's reaction. She clung to his left arm and gave it a gentle shake. Aegon gave her a small nod and offered a simple compliment, saying Aenys's voice was deep and melodious. Visenya, meanwhile, couldn't help but find the whole exchange amusing. Aegon's secret plan to usurp control of the faith of the Seven was known only to a few close advisors. Rhaenys clearly had no idea and still believed Aegon had genuinely converted. In truth, Aegon deeply distrusted the church, and now, with Aenys earnestly learning their songs, it was like someone flattering a dragon and getting bitten on the leg. Just then, Lady Argilla noticed the growing tension and quickly stepped in with a smile. I've also heard Prince Aenys is a maester in training, how clever he is. I only wish my Mond were half as bright. Aegon's brows twitched slightly, a faint frown forming as he thought to himself, why are they all lavishing praise on Aenys? Prince Aenys is humble and well-mannered, full of kingly grace. With the kingdom's great council approaching, perhaps we should simply announce him as the heir prince, Shera added smoothly, smiling at Aegon as she picked up the thread of the conversation. In that instant, the women around the table, and even the laughing children at the far end, subtly turned their eyes to Aegon, waiting to see how he would respond. And then it all became clear to Aegon, so that's what this is all about. No wonder they were praising Aenys to the skies. Visenya's grip tightened suddenly around her wine cup. Her face turned pale, her heart pounded wildly, and countless thoughts flashed through her mind. Aegon fell silent, weighing Shara's proposal. For now, he said nothing. Rhaenys sees that Visenya is pregnant, and she knows I've kept my distance from Aenys. So now she's getting impatient, Aegon thought. At last, Queen Visenya could hold back no longer. Her tone was calm, but her words sharp. Aenys is far too frail. He's already 5, yet he still can't lift a longsword. What kind of king could he possibly be? With that, Queen Visenya lifted her wine cup and took a quiet sip. Since birth, Aenys had been sickly and weak. His limbs were thin and fragile, his eyes always teary, and he'd cried constantly as an infant. Even the royal maesters had worried he might not survive. He refused to drink from a wet nurse, taking milk only from his mother. When it came time to wean him, he screamed and wailed for half a month straight. In short, he was nothing like Aegon and had not inherited the strong physique of the continent's mightiest man. This physical frailty had long been a point of criticism among the court's ministers. The Targaryen dynasty was still new, and foreign wars were far from over. Knowing the conqueror's nature, even if Westeros were fully subdued, his hunger for conquest would not end. In such an age, a weak and unmartial heir like Aenys was a glaring flaw. Rhaenys hadn't expected her sister to shame her and her son so openly. Her face flushed red with anger. She slammed her fist on the table and stood abruptly, shouting at her sister. So that's where all those whispers in court came from. You've been the source all along, haven't you? To slander the heir prince like this, what exactly are you scheming? Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. If you'd like to support my work and unlock advanced chapters, you can follow me on Patreon. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. Patreon.com, BlurryDream. BlurryDream creators' thoughts. 5 comments 0 vote. Chapter 100. The Birth of Maegor. Visenya raised her head coldly, locking eyes with Rhaenys, who met her gaze without the slightest sign of backing down. Enough. Do you all think I am no longer fit to rule? Or that I'm already half in the grave? Aegon suddenly slammed the table, his voice thunderous with anger. The heavy thud startled the children, making them all flinch. Shera sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, staring at Aegon with apprehension. In that moment, she realized she had gotten herself tangled in something she shouldn't have touched. But Shera had no real choice. She had agreed to Rhaenys' request because the bloody gate of the Vale was still in the hands of vassals loyal directly to Queen Rhaenys. In return for her support, Rhaenys had promised that once Aenys ascended the throne, she would return the bloody gate to the Lord of the Vale. The bloody gate was a crucial mountain pass and the gateway to the Vale. For thousands of years, House Arryn had relied on it to hold off countless enemies. Only with control of the bloody gate could House Arryn truly feel secure. The flower of the mountain, Arryn, had been an Arryn first, and only later became a lover of King Aegon. Visenya, aware that she'd acted too rashly, quietly set down her wine cup. Without another word, she turned, gave a slight flick of her flowing, voluminous skirt, and exited the banquet hall. Rhaenys sat still, her chest heaving, staring blankly at the now empty seat where her sister had been. She hadn't meant to lose her patience, but the pressure Visenya exerted on her had become too much. Visenya's charisma had earned her a loyal following in court, and Rhaenys knew full well that, aside from knowing how to please Aegon, she simply couldn't compare. She had tried attending small council meetings, but she barely understood the policies being discussed, much less their purpose. There, she had felt like nothing more than a puppet. In time, Rhaenys came to accept that she had no talent for politics. And then there was Aenys, frail from birth, soft-featured, and entirely unlike his father Aegon in both looks and bearing. Now, with Visenya pregnant again, Rhaenys was truly afraid. Her domineering sister had always loved taking what belonged to her, be it toys or affection. Aegon had once been hers alone in childhood, but even he had been shared with her sister in the end. She couldn't bear to watch her son's rightful crown taken away too. The more she thought, the more wronged she felt. She stood trembling, shoulders quivering, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Seeing his mother in tears, little Aenys wore a miserable expression. He pushed back his chair and ran over to her, hugging her leg tightly. Don't cry, mother. Aenys will try hard. I'll be a good boy, don't cry. Aegon watched his wife and child, both so fragile and sad, and his heart softened. He began to understand the reason behind Rhaenys' outburst. With a wave of his hand, he gestured for his lovers to take their children and leave the hall. Rhaedel stood, bowed, and gently led little Garth away. The other two lovers also gave Aegon a respectful nod and quietly withdrew. Soon, only Aegon, Rhaenys, and Aenys remained in the dining room. Now alone with her husband and son, Rhaenys let go of all restraint and burst into tears. Aegon stepped forward and reached out to touch her cheek, but she turned away, refusing his hand. He sighed to himself. Even as a mother, she still acts like a sulky little girl. Bending down, he scooped up little Aenys and set him on the dining table. Gently rubbing the boy's tear-streaked face, he said softly, "A man doesn't cry so easily." Aenys stared at his father, stunned. Aegon smiled and asked, "Your mother wants you to be the heir prince. Tell me, son, do you want to be the heir?" Aenys glanced at his mother. The moment their eyes met, Rhaenys began furiously blinking at him. I want to be the heir prince," Aenys said in his soft, childish voice. Seeing that his sister could still joke around even while crying, Aegon gave her a light swat on the rear and gently scolded her for being so mischievous. "And do you know what it means to be the heir prince? What you'll need to do?" Aegon asked with a grin, pinching Aenys' plump, cherubic cheeks. Ow, father, that hurts, Aenys said, shaking his head and trying to escape the rough hand. Then, with a stubborn little pout, he declared, the heir prince is going to be king one day, so I have to learn how to govern the kingdom. Mother says she doesn't know how to govern, and that's why she can't beat Aunt Visenya. At that, Rhaenys couldn't help but let out a few small coughs. Aegon frowned slightly and turned to look at her. Rhaenys shifted her body again, fully turning her back to both father and son. Since you want to learn how to handle state affairs, then starting tomorrow, you'll stay by my side and learn what governance truly means. Aegon gently ruffled Aenys's soft, straight silver hair, then added, but being a good king isn't just about knowledge. You mustn't neglect your martial training either. Understand? As he spoke, Aegon showed Aenys his own palms, calloused and rough from years of sword practice. I understand, father. I'll work hard to become a strong warrior, Aenys said with an eager nod. Aegon gave a faint smile, picked Aenys up from the table, and patted his back gently. Go on, get some rest. Don't stay up overthinking. Your father has high hopes for you, you'll make a fine heir prince. Aenys replied and trotted out of the dining hall. Aegon suddenly pulled Rhaenys into his arms, laid her across his lap, and gave her a few firm smacks on the rear. What exactly have you been teaching Aenys? Stirring up palace intrigue within the royal family. Do you think the Targaryen dynasty has been running too smoothly and needs a little chaos? Rhaenys flushed crimson. She twisted in his arms and grumbled, well, you're the one who keeps your distance from Aenys. If you won't teach him, then I have to, his mother has too. And that hurt, you brute. Without a word, Aegon lifted her onto the dining table and bent her over it, continuing the lesson. Well now, I'm teaching you myself. Satisfied? You still haven't promised to name Aenys heir at the Great Council. Are you waiting on the one in Visenya's belly? You heartless man, when we were kids, you said you only loved me. Then you married my sister and collected all these mistresses. Rhaenys protested, writhing beneath him. I'll teach Aenys myself for a while. If he's not lacking in ability, I'll declare him heir to the realm. Aegon smirked. Struggle all you want, makes it even more fun, hee hee. At the turn of the 10th year of the conquest, King's Landing, the capital of the Targaryen kingdom, welcomed a massive wave of visiting nobles from across the realm. At the time, there weren't many structures outside the Red Keep. Most of them were modest two-story wooden lodges, but King's Landing's entertainment industry was surprisingly vibrant. Aegon had imported various forms of entertainment from his previous life, and many gambling stalls were quietly funded by the royal household. Thanks to the upcoming tournament, betting booths for the contests were especially numerous. The card parlor Aegon had introduced was also a favorite among the nobility. Naturally, the pleasure houses were thriving as well. These brothels, extensions of Highgarden's famed Flower Street, were run by Rhaedel, one of Aegon's lovers. Beyond entertainment, however, what truly captured the nobles' attention were the innovations emerging from the new citadel at Harrenhal: refined white sugar, quality paper, and an array of steel weapons. The metallurgy school housed in Lion Tower had developed a steel annealing process that made this ancillary material far easier to forge. In the past, crafting a single steel sword could take a master smith months of relentless hammering, often yielding only one or two blades. But with the advent of annealing, steel output skyrocketed. Shops in the outer city of King's Landing were now stocked with steel swords and armor. Nobles couldn't hide their desire. Steel weapons, once priceless rarities, were now available in bulk. Many lords didn't hesitate to drain their coffers just to buy a set of full-body steel armor, worthy of becoming a family heirloom. The new citadel's influence on Westeros was sweeping. While Aegon tightly controlled philosophical schools that could sway minds, he allowed all other foundational knowledge to be freely spread throughout the kingdom. In the book towers of King's Landing's outer city, shelves were lined with volumes printed on white paper, guides on waterwheels, farming tools, transportation, horse tack, recipes, and much more. This wealth of knowledge was strictly reserved for citizens of the Targaryen kingdom. If any foreign nation attempted to steal it, they would be forced to pay not only a heavy fine to the Targaryen dynasty but also an annual knowledge tax. And don't assume other kingdoms were outside the Targaryens' reach. Now that the dynasty had unified the continent of Westeros, they had become the world's de facto superpower. Though still far behind the Freehold in many respects, their influence was immense. Any nation that refused to pay fines and knowledge taxes would soon find itself facing the iron hooves of the Dragonlord's army, and with just cause. From the war of conquest against Dorne, Aegon had learned one vital lesson: he couldn't be perceived as a tyrannical invader. To conquer foreign lands effectively, he needed a justifiable reason. Without it, resistance from the native populace would be fierce. And now, as the Targaryen dynasty stood atop the world stage, every move it made rippled across the global balance of power. The 9 free cities had once been colonized and enslaved by the Freehold for thousands of years. The last thing they wanted was another empire rising to dominate and exploit them. Aerion, the president of the Free City Council, wrote to Aegon, warning that under the pressure of the Targaryen dynasty, the 9 free cities were already beginning to form an alliance. He confessed that even his attempts to sway smaller city-states within the council were growing harder to control. Aegon was simply waiting for any nation on the continent of Essos to dare provoke the Targaryens. The moment they did, he would have his excuse to strike. Westeros had only just begun to stabilize. And after a brief period of rest and recovery, even if Essos made no hostile move, Aegon might not be able to resist starting a conflict himself. In King's Landing, aside from entertainment and new products from the Citadel, one particularly bustling and exciting attraction had emerged: a stone tower near the gates of the gods at the Red Keep. This tower, known as Dragon Lake Real Estate, was built in extravagant fashion, with artificial fountains and decorative rock gardens at its entrance. Dragon Lake was the royal center for selling residential property in the outer city. Stepping inside, visitors were greeted by a detailed miniature model of King's Landing. Behind it, a screen displayed prominent landmarks like the Blackwater Rush and other notable sites around the capital. Harlan Tyrell, the steward of Highgarden, had come to attend the Great Council. It was his first visit to King's Landing. After his audience with the king at the Red Keep, he noticed the lively Dragon Lake Real Estate Tower on his way out. These outer city houses are all wooden shacks. Surely the royal family's new properties won't sell that well, Harlan thought with a hint of amusement. But the moment he stepped inside, he was stunned. The interior was packed. People crowded shoulder to shoulder, lining up in long queues. Many looked anxious, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the front. From one of the sales attendants, Harlan learned that all the people in line were nobles and officials of the realm, here to buy pre-sale homes in the outer city. Because Aegon only released a limited number of homes each day, buyers had to line up and enter a lottery for the chance to purchase one. At this point, just winning the lottery to buy a home from Dragon Lake had become a valuable asset in itself, hence the frenzied crowd. This method of selling houses, it's not far off from gambling, Harlan muttered to himself. But the real estate lottery was just one of Aegon's many innovations. His fresh policies and reforms were gradually reshaping every corner of the kingdom, and everyone living in it. On New Year's Eve, within Aegon's hall just outside the Red Keep, the Second Great Council of the Targaryen dynasty convened as scheduled. The foremost matter on the agenda was the conferral of titles in Dorne. Aegon appointed Orys as Lord of Dorne and designated Sunspear as the seat of House Baratheon. The veteran who had fought alongside Aegon for 10 years finally received his own fiefdom, fulfilling the promise Aegon had made when Orys first pledged his loyalty. There was little controversy over this first agenda item. A few lords with staunch traditional values voiced minor objections to Orys' status as a bastard, but considering his contributions to the kingdom, they said no more. The second agenda item, the appointment of the Warden of the Southeast and the claim to the title of Lord of the Riverbend, sparked considerable debate. Due to the Reach's lackluster performance in the Dornish War and its limited territorial gains, the ducal title was ultimately left vacant and the dispute postponed. Following these two items, Aegon moved on to grant titles for various unclaimed lands within Dorne. Because of Aegon's extermination orders against entire bloodlines, many earldoms and knightly holdings in Dorne were left without lords. Even after rewarding those who had rendered meritorious service, large areas of land remained vacant. Aegon then declared these lands would revert to the crown. Most of these territories lay in the eastern part of Dorne, known as the Broken Arm, conveniently adjoining the crown-controlled stepstones. Notably, Little Garth was granted a noble earldom by Aegon for his achievements in the Dornish War. He was given the surname Garth Gardener and infeft with the fiefdom of Skyreach. Skyreach was built on a stony mountainside, guarding the prince's pass through the Red Mountains, the most direct route linking Dorne and the Reach. Upon seeing Little Garth's surname and fiefdom, many nobles from the Reach immediately understood King Aegon's intent. Harlan, seeing this, could only sigh inwardly. The Tyrells had shown little military strength and had gained nothing from the Dornish campaign, so it seemed the title of Lord of the Riverbend was out of reach. With that, the first day of the Great Council came to a close. In the days that followed, Aegon issued several laws with far-reaching implications for the kingdom. One such law was the Dragon Training Act, which bore similarities to Valyria's own laws on dragon taming. It served to restrict and control the use of dragons. The first article of the Targaryen Dragon Training Act stipulated, in the known world, only members of the Targaryen royal bloodline were qualified to tame dragons. Any individual outside of House Targaryen who attempted to do so would be deemed an enemy of the Targaryen dynasty and would be executed by the Targaryen army. The second article stated, if a Targaryen woman married outside the family, any dragon she had tamed could not be passed on to another house. Upon the death of the tamer, the dragon must return to the royal family. In this legislation, Aegon clearly emphasized that only those bearing the Targaryen name could tame dragons. This significantly increased the odds of completing his main quest. As long as House Targaryen retained control over the dragons, the family's prospects for survival would greatly improve. In fact, many of Aegon's vague or seemingly self-serving policies were all designed to increase his main quest's success rate. For instance, he allowed bastards to inherit the Targaryen name in order to revive House Targaryen. He was well aware that such a move might inspire bastard-born branches to one day overthrow the royal line and claim power for themselves. Yet this posed a threat only to the direct royal line, not to his quest. On the contrary, it ensured that even in the event of House Targaryen's downfall, a path to resurgence would remain. With the large-scale conquest of Westeros complete, Aegon finally heard the system notification once again. Ding! Congratulations, player, on unifying the continent of Westeros. You have achieved a hero-level accomplishment and earned one free hero-level lottery draw. Guaranteed to yield a hero-level item. As there was no immediate danger, Aegon didn't use the draw right away. He closed the system prompt and continued addressing the matters brought forth at the Great Council. The 7-day council, apart from the first day's rewards and title grants, focused on refining the laws of the Targaryen dynasty. The previously implemented unified laws still contained many impractical elements and required adjustment. Additionally, demands from the High Lords, minor nobles, and knights were also raised during the council. As ruler of the kingdom, Aegon listened to these voices and enacted certain laws to reflect the realities of the new regime. After the council concluded, King's Landing did not quiet down. On the contrary, many nobles grew fond of the city and decided to stay long-term, purchasing various pre-sale homes. With Westeros newly unified and no fresh wars ignited during the 10th year of the conquest, the people named this spring the Year of Budding, an expression of hope for the fledgling kingdom. At the end of the 10th year of the conquest, Queen Visenya, after 10 months of pregnancy, successfully gave birth to a baby. Before the birth, Queen Visenya had confidently declared that it would be a boy, and she was right. King Aegon named his second son Maegor. When the young prince was born, both the maesters and the midwives agreed. Maegor was the most vigorous newborn they had ever seen. His birth weight was nearly double that of his elder brother, Aenys. Up to 20 chapters ahead for now. P. A Trian Comp. BlurryDream.